We were sitting in a high-end restaurant. You know the type, the kind that requires a reservation weeks in advance, right in the heart of downtown. My son insisted we meet up. His wife, puffing her chest out with pride, announced that she was pregnant. But before I could even swallow my bite of steak to properly congratulate them, my son looked me dead in the eye. He casually dropped the bomb that they needed my 4-bedroom house. With a staggering level of calmness, he suggested I sign over the deed immediately. He told me to move into a tiny condo, arguing that it was the most practical setup for an old man living alone. He said it with the same casual confidence a guy uses to order a cheap appetizer off the menu. I just smiled. I congratulated them on the baby. And then, keeping my voice dead even, I asked him why exactly his housing situation was my problem. The entire restaurant seemed to drop into a dead silence. My name is Eugene. I am 69 years old. I'm a retired general contractor and builder, and I am a man who flat out refuses to be treated like a disposable resource by his own flesh and blood. Before I keep telling you how a simple family dinner turned into a ruthless war for my dignity, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. Drop a like and subscribe if you've ever had to stand up to entitled family members who tried to piggyback off your life's hard work. I never raised my son to be a beggar dressed in a tailored suit. But that night, under the dim lights of that fancy restaurant, I realized he had morphed into exactly that. The sheer audacity of his request didn't just insult me. It tried to erase decades of my history with a single stroke. It erased the early mornings, the freezing winters, and the sweat equity I put in to secure a piece of the American dream for my family. He sat across from me, swirling a glass of ridiculously expensive wine, just waiting for me to hand over the keys to my kingdom simply because the golden boy had decided he was ready to inherit it. Derek leaned forward, interlacing his fingers over the spotless white tablecloth. He used that polished corporate manager voice he'd perfected over the years, the one designed to sound perfectly reasonable but that actually masks pure, unadulterated narcissism. He started giving me a lecture on family responsibility. He said, "A kid needs room to grow, Dad, a big backyard to play in, and a safe suburb with a good school district." He pointed out that my house was practically empty now that his mother, my Diane, was gone. He tried to paint the whole thing as a logical transition, like my home was just surplus inventory ready to be reassigned to the most needy department of his life. He told me it made absolutely zero financial sense for an old man to take up that much square footage. I looked down at his hands resting on the table. They were soft hands, perfect cuticles. He had never held a framing hammer, nor had he ever poured a single cubic yard of concrete. He didn't know the blood, the sweat, and the sheer willpower it takes to pull a life up from the dirt. 40 years ago, I was a young man of color fighting tooth and nail for every construction bid. I was operating in a city that actively worked to keep minority-owned businesses at the bottom. Diane and I bought an overgrown, weed-choked, vacant lot when nobody else saw the potential. I poured the foundation of that 4-bedroom house with my own 2 hands. I framed those walls during winters that chilled you right down to the bone. Diane picked out the mahogany kitchen cabinets and painted every inch of the trim. Every single nail driven into that house represented a sacrifice we made, so that Derek could grow up without ever tasting the bitter sting of poverty. And now he was looking at my life's masterpiece as a convenient real estate upgrade for his growing family. Madison, his wife, chimed in, adjusting her designer silk scarf. She stated with total confidence that they had already started looking at paint swatches for the nursery. She mentioned that the room with the best morning light would be absolutely perfect for the crib. That room was currently my home office, the exact spot where Diane spent her final days reading. They had already mentally evicted me before the appetizers even hit the table. I let them finish their perfectly rehearsed pitch. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show an ounce of anger or hurt. I simply took a slow sip of my ice water. I wiped my mouth carefully with the linen napkin and offered them a polite but ice-cold smile. "Congratulations on the baby," I said, looking right at Madison. Then I locked my eyes onto my son. "But why exactly is your lack of space my problem?" Derek blinked hard. That confident corporate mask slipped right off his face for a fraction of a second. He stammered, He started repeating that we were family and that I didn't need all that space anymore. Madison's fake, polite smile vanished instantly. Her face flushed a furious, blotchy red as the reality of my refusal registered in her brain. She slammed her hand flat against the table. The expensive wine glasses clinked, drawing stares from the nearby booths. She announced for the whole restaurant to hear that I was a selfish, stone-hearted old man. She demanded to know how I could deny my own unborn grandson a safe and decent home. She tried to use public shaming to break my will, putting on a theatrical performance to force my submission. I didn't play into her calculated tantrum for a single second. I reached into my suit jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. I placed it neatly under my water glass to cover the exact cost of my steak and my drink. I provided a proper home for my son, I told Derek. My voice was deep, firm, and unshakable. It is your job to provide one for yours. Don't you ever ask me to hand over the foundation I built, just so you can avoid the heavy lifting of building your own. I stood up from the table. I adjusted my coat with absolute composure and walked right out of the restaurant. I left them sitting there in stunned, humiliated silence, surrounded by the judging whispers of the other diners. I walked to my truck with my head held high. I didn't look back once. The drive home was quiet and lonely. I felt a heavy disappointment settling deep into my chest. A massive wave of sadness washed over me, recognizing the kind of greedy man my son had chosen to become. I genuinely believed that setting a hard, immovable boundary would be the end of the discussion. I assumed the public embarrassment at the restaurant would teach them that my property and my dignity were not up for negotiation. I unlocked my front door, the solid oak door I installed myself 3 decades ago. I went straight to bed, hoping a good night's sleep would wash away the bitter taste of the evening. I woke up early the next morning at my usual time. It's a habit hardwired into me from decades in the construction trades. I walked into the kitchen to brew a strong pot of black coffee. The morning sun was shining bright through the window Diane used to love. I reached for the wooden key rack hanging on the wall by the side door to grab my garage keys. My hand stopped dead in midair. The brass hook where I always kept the spare set of house keys was completely empty. A cold, sharp realization ran down my spine. The boundary I set at dinner wasn't the end of the conflict. It was their declaration of war. I didn't waste a single second standing in my kitchen, wondering what to do. I grabbed my jacket, deadbolted the side door, and drove straight to Home Depot to buy 3 high-security deadbolts. I knew exactly who had taken those keys. I knew I had a very narrow window of time to secure my property, but I was already too late. As I turned the corner onto my quiet suburban street an hour later, I saw it. A massive yellow U-Haul moving truck was illegally parked, blocking my driveway. The heavy metal ramp was fully extended, crushing Diane's prized hydrangea bushes near the walkway. 2 burly guys in matching uniforms were struggling to haul a massive modern velvet sofa up my front steps. And right there, standing on my own front porch, holding a clipboard and a giant iced coffee, was Madison. She was pointing and barking orders at the movers like she owned the place. She had used my stolen spare key to unlock my front door, letting perfect strangers track dirt onto my hardwood floors. The sheer, blinding audacity of the scene defied all logic. I parked my truck on the street, killed the engine, and got out. I didn't yell. I didn't run. I walked up my driveway with the slow, calculated steps of a man who is about to dismantle a fantasy. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a calculated home invasion. They honestly believed that if they forced their way in, if they created a reality where their furniture was already sitting in my living room, I would just bow my head, hand over my life's work, and walk away defeated. Madison saw me approaching, and her posture instantly stiffened. She quickly plastered on a sickeningly sweet, entirely fake smile that didn't reach her eyes. She trotted down the porch steps, acting as if she were welcoming me to her own home. She cheerfully announced that Derek was at the office, finishing a presentation. So she had decided to take the initiative and get a head start on the move. She spoke to me with that condescending tone you'd use on a confused toddler. She even had the nerve to pat me on the arm. She told me not to worry about packing my things. She proudly stated that she and the movers had already boxed up my bedroom They stacked it neatly in the garage, making sure I could easily load it into a rental van once I found a suitable little condo. I looked right past her. I ordered the two movers to drop the couch immediately. The men froze, sensing the intense, unforgiving authority in my voice. They slowly lowered the heavy piece of furniture onto the grass. Madison's fake smile vanished, replaced by an ugly, aggressive sneer. She stood in front of me, crossing her arms, dropping the polite act entirely. She told me I was being ridiculous. She said the house was practically theirs anyway, and that I needed to stop making a scene and accept the transition. I told her she had exactly 5 seconds to get her things off my property before I treated her like any other trespasser. The second she realized I wasn't going to back down, her entire demeanor flipped. She deployed her ultimate weapon. She started sobbing hysterically. She clutched her belly, pretending she couldn't catch her breath. She played the role of a terrified, oppressed, pregnant woman to perfection. She wailed loudly, making sure the movers and the neighbors who were starting to peek out onto their porches could hear her. She screamed that I was attacking her, that I was causing extreme stress to her unborn child, and that I was a cruel, violent man, kicking his vulnerable daughter-in-law out onto the street. She weaponized her tears with expert precision. She calculated that the image of a crying pregnant woman facing off against an older man of color would instantly turn public opinion against me. I didn't argue with her. I didn't raise my hands, nor did I take a step toward her to defend myself against her theatrical accusations. I knew better than to fall into that dangerous narrative. I simply pulled my phone from my pocket. I dialed 911 and calmly reported a breaking and entering and a burglary in progress at my exact address. Madison stopped crying for a fraction of a second. Her eyes went wide with pure panic before she frantically pulled out her own phone to call Derek. Less than 10 minutes later, a cruiser pulled up with its lights flashing. 2 officers stepped out, their hands resting naturally on their duty belts. Madison immediately ran toward them, tears streaming down her face, pointing a shaking finger at me. She unleashed a hysterical story about a family dispute. She claimed this was her house, she was pregnant, and her father-in-law was having a mental breakdown and becoming violent. Just as she was finishing her performance, Derek's car came screeching into the driveway. He jumped out in his expensive suit, rushing over to play the role of the smooth-talking professional. He gave the officers a tight, cooperative smile. He told them it was just a misunderstanding with his elderly father, assuring them he had the situation under control. I let them dig their own graves. Then I stepped forward. I didn't speak to my son or his wife. I addressed the officers directly. I pulled up my digital property tax receipts and the scanned copy of the deed I always keep backed up on my phone. I handed the officers my state ID. I clearly stated that I was the sole legal owner of the property. I told them I had never invited these people inside and that they had used a stolen key to force entry. The officers reviewed my documents. Their expressions shifted from cautious to stern. They turned to Derek and asked for his proof of residency. He stammered, going pale, admitting he didn't have any. The commanding officer pointed at the U-Haul. He told Derek and Madison they were officially trespassing on private property. He ordered the movers to load the couch back onto the truck. Then he instructed my son and his wife to vacate the premises immediately, or they would be arrested. Derek stood there completely humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood. His corporate pride was shattered into a million pieces. The police escorted them off my property, watching closely as the moving truck backed out of my driveway in absolute defeat. The street finally went quiet. The spectacle was over, leaving a heavy tension in its wake. I walked back into my house and shut the front door firmly. The physical invasion had been stopped, but I needed to inspect the damage they'd done while I was gone. I walked down the hallway, checking the walls and floors until I reached my home office, the room Madison had so casually claimed for her imaginary nursery. I noticed immediately that my heavy mahogany desk had been shifted slightly to the left. A cold dread settled into my gut. I walked around the desk and looked at the wall safe hidden behind a framed picture of Diane and me. The frame was crooked. I pushed it aside, and my blood ran ice cold. They hadn't just come to drop off furniture and force me out. The digital keypad on my safe was deeply scratched. The thick metal panel around the edges showed fresh, aggressive gouge marks from being pried at with a crowbar. They had tried to breach my secure documents. This was no longer just a temper tantrum by spoiled kids over real estate. They were actively looking for something very specific, and I was about to find out exactly how far my own son was willing to go. I left the damaged safe alone. The scars on the metal told me they were desperate, but Derek was never any good with tools. He was a creature of digital habits. I walked over to my desk, opened my laptop, and logged into my secure banking portal. Years ago, when Derek first moved into his own apartment, I gave him an authorized user credit card linked to my primary account. I told him it was strictly for absolute emergencies. A medical crisis, a broken-down car, a true disaster. He hadn't used it in 5 years, but when the main dashboard loaded a flashing red alert, cut across the top of the screen, the available balance had been wiped out. $50,000 had vanished in a span of 72 hours. I clicked on the recent transactions. My jaw tightened with every line I read. There were no hospital bills, no charges from an auto repair shop. There was a $5,000 charge at an imported Italian furniture boutique. Clearly the down payment for that velvet couch and nursery set they tried to force into my house today. There were multiple charges at an elite maternity boutique, and right at the top, currently pending, was a massive charge for a VIP prenatal retreat at a downtown luxury spa. My own son hadn't just tried to steal my physical house. He was actively looting my financial reserves to fund a lifestyle he couldn't afford. The sheer disrespect washed over me, cold and calculating. I stared at the screen, letting the reality of the theft settle in. He thought he could outsmart me by attacking on multiple fronts at once. If the home invasion failed, the financial embezzlement would already be underway. It was a cowardly, bottom-feeding maneuver. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, staring at the glowing numbers. Growing up as a minority in a neighborhood where the system was rigged to keep you broke, I learned early on that trust was an expensive luxury. When I started my construction business, the banks didn't want to lend me money. Suppliers demanded cash up front. I had to build my credit history with the same meticulous, paranoid precision I used to frame houses. Every dollar was tracked. Every financial risk was calculated and mitigated. Diane and I skipped vacations, drove beat-up trucks, and clipped coupons so we could build a fortress of financial security. I taught those exact same principles to Derek. I sat him down at this very desk when he was a teenager. I showed him how compound interest worked, how debt could enslave a man, and how a spotless financial reputation was his most vital shield in a world that would be happy to see him fail. I gave him that emergency card as a safety net, a father's promise that he would never truly freefall. Seeing him use that safety net as a weapon to buy designer, baby, furniture, and spa treatments for a woman who just tried to steal my house, it wasn't just a disappointment. It was a profound, unforgivable betrayal. He crossed the ultimate line. He wasn't acting out of desperation or a momentary lapse in judgment. He was operating under the arrogant assumption that my net worth was his personal playground. He thought I was just a senile old man who would eventually surrender. Too tired to fight back, too desperate for a relationship with my future grandson to cut off the cash flow. He mistook my quiet nature for weakness. He mistook my patience as a father for stupidity. I snapped the laptop shut. The sadness I had felt the night before was completely gone, burned away by a cold, razor-sharp clarity. Derek was no longer acting like a son. He was acting like a parasite, and it was time to amputate. I refused to let anyone dismantle the legacy Diane and I had bled for. Flesh and blood, or not a thief, is a thief. My tolerance for his delusions of grandeur had completely evaporated. I didn't call him to demand an explanation. I didn't send a furious text message. I grabbed my coat and drove straight to the main branch of my bank. I didn't use the phone because I wanted this handled with absolute immediate authority. I walked into the branch manager's office, a man who had handled my accounts for 15 years, and I instructed him to lock everything down. I canceled the authorized user card immediately. I flagged every single transaction from the last 72 hours as unauthorized and initiated a formal fraud investigation. I froze the connected checking accounts and changed every password security question and authorization protocol on my profile. I cut the financial umbilical cord with a few keystrokes. At that exact moment, across town, Madison was lounging in a plush robe at a luxury spa. According to the timeline I pieced together later, she had treated 3 of her wealthy friends to a full day of prenatal massages, champagne facials, and overpriced lunches all on my dime. She was holding court, playing the role of the affluent, successful mother-to-be. When the spa receptionist presented the bill, Madison confidently handed over the shiny platinum card with my account number on it. The receptionist ran it through the terminal, declined. Madison laughed it off as a simple machine error, assuring her friends it was just a bank security glitch. She demanded they run it again, her voice taking on that familiar tone of entitlement. The receptionist manually typed in the numbers. Declined. A fraud alert flashed instantly on the spa's screen, instructing the merchant to retain the card. The receptionist, keeping a polite but firm tone, informed Madison that the card had been reported stolen and asked for an alternate form of payment. Madison stood there in her expensive robe, her face burning beet red. She was utterly humiliated in front of the very women she was trying to impress. She didn't have any other cards with that kind of limit. She had to beg her friends to split the massive bill. The illusion she had so carefully crafted for her social circle was shattered in an instant. She was forced to admit she couldn't cover her own extravagant tab, exposing the harsh truth behind her fake wealth. I was barely backing my truck into my driveway when my cell phone started vibrating uncontrollably in the cup holder. It was Derek. The second I answered, he didn't even say hello. He was practically hyperventilating, screaming into the receiver with a fury I had never heard from him before. He yelled that I had publicly humiliated his wife, that her friends were laughing at her, and that I was a petty, vindictive monster for cutting off the card without warning. He demanded I call the bank immediately to lift the fraud alert and pay the spa bill. I listened to his frantic, arrogant screaming without saying a single word. My silence only fueled his panic. In a desperate attempt to regain control, he deployed the only weapon he thought he had left. He hissed through the phone, his voice dripping with venom. "You made a massive mistake today, old man. You embarrass my wife like this, and I swear to God you will never, ever set eyes on this kid. You are going to die alone in that big empty house, and you will never see your grandson." I didn't respond to his empty threats. I hung up the phone and blocked his number completely. Silence was the only appropriate response to a tantrum of that magnitude, but the silence didn't last long. 2 days later, I received a voicemail from a number I rarely saw on my screen. It was Thomas Madison's father. He used a jovial, overly familiar tone, inviting me to lunch at his exclusive country club on the outskirts of the city. He said it was time for the adults to sit down and iron out this little family misunderstanding. I knew exactly what this was about. Thomas and his wife, Natalie, considered themselves high society, the type of people who hide their prejudices behind polite smiles and pastel polo shirts. They thought they could summon the retired minority contractor to their turf, dazzle me with their country club membership, and intimidate me into submission. I put on my best tailored suit, the charcoal gray one Diane always loved. I drove out to the club. The valet tried to direct my truck to the back lot, but I handed him a heavy tip and parked it right in front of the main clubhouse doors. I walked into the dining room with my head held high. The air conditioning was freezing, standing in stark contrast to the burning air of superiority radiating from the room. Thomas and Natalie were already seated at a prime table overlooking the 18th hole. Thomas stood up, flashing a rehearsed politician's smile, while Natalie offered a tight, uncomfortable nod. They were dressed in pristine golf attire, exuding an air of prefabricated superiority. I sat across from them, asking the waiter for nothing but a glass of sparkling water. I didn't exchange pleasantries. I didn't ask about his golf game or the weather. I just stared at them with a cold, unwavering focus, waiting for them to put their cards on the table. Thomas cleared his throat, adjusting the collar of his expensive-looking shirt. He launched into a condescending monologue about how difficult it can be for people from my background to manage significant assets as they age. He hit every classic microaggression, speaking slowly and deliberately, avoiding direct words like race or class, but leaving the implications incredibly thick in the air. He suggested that managing a 4-bedroom property and maintaining financial portfolios was simply too overwhelming for a man of my age and history. He used terms like cognitive decline and legacy protection, looking at me like I was a helpless charity case. Natalie stirred her mimosa, chiming in to say that Derek and Madison were simply trying to ease my burden. And then came the ultimate insult. Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and presented his grand solution. He proposed a private off-market sale. He offered to buy my house for a lump sum of cash, a number so insultingly low it was barely a quarter of the property's actual market value. He tried to dress up this blatant robbery as a generous favor. He claimed he was stepping in to protect his future grandson from housing instability, ensuring the baby had a proper foundation because I was clearly struggling to provide one. He had the audacity to suggest that taking the house off my hands was saving me from inevitable financial ruin. I sat there listening to this mediocre man try to scam me out of my life's work. My mind drifted back to the late 70s. While Thomas was probably coasting through college on his daddy's dime, I was working double shifts on dangerous job sites, fighting for fair wages and dealing with suppliers who refused to shake my hand. I built my net worth through grueling, relentless labor. I managed my money with flawless precision because I knew society would never give me a second chance if I failed. And now this man with his fake country club tan was sitting across from me trying to gaslight me out of my home, using fake concern for a grandson as a weapon. He looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to eagerly accept his pathetic bailout. I saw Natalie nodding along her posture, radiating unjustified arrogance. They honestly believed I was an uneducated pawn who would be dazzled by a lowball cash offer from a supposedly superior savior. I didn't raise my voice. I simply picked up my sparkling water, took a slow sip and set it back down exactly on the coaster. I looked at Thomas's wrist resting so proudly on the table. "Thomas," I said softly, "that's a very flashy watch. An Oyster Perpetual right." He puffed his chest out, smiling smugly, and confirmed it was. I leaned in just a fraction. "It's a shame the second-hand ticks. Rolex uses a perpetual mechanical movement. Yours ticks like a cheap quartz knockoff. The magnification on the date window is also completely wrong, and the bezel alignment is off by 2 millimeters. It's a decent replica, but it's still fake." Thomas's face went paper white. He quickly pulled his arm off the table, hiding his wrist under the white tablecloth. Before Natalie could gasp in defense of her husband, I shifted my gaze to the designer handbag, resting proudly on the empty chair beside her. "And Natalie," I continued, my tone pleasant but razor-sharp, "that's a gorgeous seasonal bag. What a wild coincidence that the mail return tag from a luxury rental website is still tucked into the front zipper. I saw you trying to shove it down when I walked up to the table." Natalie turned a bright shade of crimson, her hand instinctively flying to cover the expensive purse. The illusion of their vast generational wealth was shattered in under 30 seconds. "Look," I said, placing my hands firmly on the table. "I spent 40 years evaluating building materials, identifying structural flaws and spotting cheap facades. You two are standing on a crumbling foundation. You came here wanting to steal my house for pennies because you are terrified. Your daughter is going to ask you for a financial bailout that you absolutely cannot afford. You want my property to cover up your own bankruptcy." I reached into my wallet, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, and dropped it on the table. "That covers my water and whatever cheap drinks you're having. Let me make this incredibly clear. My house is not a refugee camp for your daughter's failures. Do not ever contact me again." I stood up from the table, leaving them speechless and utterly humiliated in the middle of their precious dining room. I walked out of the country club with the same firm, deliberate stride I used to walk in. I felt a fleeting sense of victory knowing I had exposed their hollow reality. I believed dismantling their pride would force them to retreat back to their miserable, debt-ridden lives. But I underestimated the sheer desperation of cornered animals. Their humiliation didn't breed surrender. It bred a dangerous, reckless malice. 3 days later, my doorbell rang. I opened the door to find a process server standing on my porch. He handed me a thick manila envelope and walked away without saying a single word. I opened it right there in the hallway. It was a formal court summons. Thomas, Natalie, and Derek had teamed up to file a legal petition for an emergency conservatorship over my estate. They had submitted sworn affidavits falsely claiming I suffered from severe paranoia, violent outbursts, and rapid-onset dementia. They were legally asking a judge to strip me of my basic human rights, take control of my bank accounts, and force me out of my home. They wanted to make me a ward of the state, a prisoner in my own life, also they could liquidate my assets. The financial battle was over. This was a war for my freedom. I stood in my hallway staring at the legal papers, shaking slightly in my hands. The audacity of the lies printed on those official court documents was staggering. According to the sworn affidavit signed by my own son, I was a deeply unstable, violent man who had suffered a full psychotic break. The primary evidence for this so-called rapid dementia was a highly fabricated account of the U-Haul incident. Madison had written a tear-stained statement claiming I had lunged at her, screaming paranoid delusions, and that I had ruthlessly kicked a defenseless pregnant woman to the curb. She painted herself as a terrified victim trying to care for a sick old man. Meanwhile, I was described as a dangerous threat to society who needed to be committed to an institution immediately. They were asking the court to grant Derek full control over my medical decisions, my property, and every damn cent to my name. They wanted the authority to sell my house underwater to pay for my supposed specialized psychiatric care. The level of coordination required to manufacture these legal documents meant they had been planning this ambush long before that dinner at the restaurant. They had weaponized the legal system to bypass my deadbolts and my frozen bank accounts. This wasn't just a greedy real estate grab anymore. It was a calculated assassination of my character, my sanity, and my legacy. If a judge believed their carefully constructed lies, I would be legally erased. I'd be stripped of my autonomy and locked in a psych ward while they liquidated my life's work to fund their delusions of grandeur. The psychological warfare started immediately after the summons was served. My phone began ringing non-stop, hour after hour. It was Derek leaving voicemail after voicemail, swinging wildly between fake concern and direct threats. In one message, he'd use a soft, pleading voice, begging me to surrender quietly and let them help me. In the next, his tone turned ruthless. He promised that if I fought the conservatorship, he would make sure the judge locked me away in a bottom-tier state psych ward, where I'd rot in oblivion. Madison left crying messages too, telling me to stop being difficult for the sake of the baby. They wanted me to panic. They wanted me to call back, scream at them, and provide recorded evidence of an erratic, volatile old man. I didn't give them a single syllable. I kept my mouth shut, saved every voicemail, and forwarded everything to a secure cloud server. I knew reacting with anger was exactly the trap they had set. Growing up in my era, if a man of color showed anger, he was immediately labeled as dangerous. I was not going to let them weaponize my righteous rage against my freedom. Instead of yelling at a phone, I grabbed my keys and drove downtown to a high-end office building. I walked into the pristine, intimidating reception area of Sterling and Associates. Attorney Sterling was a seasoned cutthroat litigator who had successfully defended my construction firm against a massive fraudulent corporate lawsuit 20 years ago. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who didn't view courtrooms as places of justice, but as battlefields where the most prepared warrior takes all. I sat across from his massive mahogany desk and dropped the conservatorship summons right in the center. I didn't ask him to play nice. I didn't ask for peaceful family mediation. I told him my son and his in-laws were trying to bury me alive, and that I wanted to orchestrate a legal counteroffensive so devastating they would never recover. Sterling read the affidavit, and a cold, predatory smile slowly spread across his face. He leaned back in his leather chair, tapped his gold pen against the desk, and told me that defending against the petition was only half the battle. If we wanted to destroy them, we had to figure out exactly why they were suddenly so desperate for cash. We didn't waste time drafting defensive statements or begging the court for mercy. We went completely on the offensive. Sterling immediately brought in a top-tier private investigator, a former federal agent specializing in forensic accounting and asset tracking. I wrote him a blank check for his retainer and gave him a very clear directive. I wanted every financial record, tax return, credit history, and hidden debt belonging to Derek, Madison, Thomas, and Natalie, exposed down to the absolute penny. While my son and his wife were busy preparing to testify about my supposed mental decline, my legal team was quietly tearing their lives apart on a spreadsheet. I continued to play the role of the terrified, silent old man. I let Derek leave his threatening messages. I let Madison post vague, victim-baiting quotes on her social media about dealing with toxic, mentally ill family members. They were so confident in their attack strategy that they completely ignored their own exposed flanks. Sterling filed a standard delay motion for the conservatorship hearing, buying the investigator a full week to dig through their digital trash. I sat in my kitchen every night drinking black coffee, listening to Derek's messages and letting his arrogance fuel my patience. He honestly believed he had outsmarted a man who had survived decades of institutional bias, economic recessions, and cutthroat business rivals. He thought a few fake doctor's notes and some crocodile tears from his wife would be enough to break me. But he didn't realize that the very money he was trying to steal was actively funding the investigation that would ruin him. I was using my wealth to buy the ultimate truth. On the 5th day of our operation, I received a secure, encrypted email from Sterling. The subject line simply read, "Target profiles completed." I drove back to his office, my heart beating at a steady pace, my mind perfectly clear. I was ready to see what ugly reality had driven my son to commit such an unforgivable betrayal. Sterling wasn't smiling when I walked into his office. This time he was sitting behind his desk, frowning down at a thick-bound dossier. He pushed the heavy file across the mahogany toward me. He told me the investigator had struck gold, but he warned me that what I was about to read would permanently alter my understanding of my son's life. I opened the cover and my eyes scanned the highlighted financial reports, credit histories, and legal notices. A cold, heavy dread ran down my spine. The successful, affluent corporate lifestyle Derek and Madison constantly bragged about was a completely fabricated mirage. They weren't going through a temporary cash flow issue. They were standing on the absolute edge of financial ruin. My son was drowning in a catastrophic ocean of high-interest debt, hidden loans, and desperate financial shell games. As I flipped to the page summarizing his employment history and current housing situation, the true horrifying motive behind his desperate attempt to have me declared legally incompetent finally stared me right in the face. I stared at the bright red text in the investigator's report and my stomach turned to lead. Derek wasn't the successful corporate manager he pretended to be. According to internal company documents secured by the PI, my son had been unceremoniously fired 4 months ago. He wasn't laid off due to downsizing or budget cuts. He was caught actively embezzling corporate funds to cover his spiraling personal expenses. His former boss had allowed him to resign quietly to avoid a public scandal, but his career in that lucrative industry was permanently destroyed, and that was only the beginning of the nightmare. I flipped to the next page detailing their housing situation. The luxury downtown apartment Madison constantly flexed on social media. The one with panoramic views, the rooftop pool, and 2 4-hour concierge service. It was a complete financial sinkhole. They were exactly 5 months behind on rent. Attached to the financial breakdown was a formal eviction notice filed by the building's management group. The document confirmed that if they didn't pay the massive debt in full within the next 14 days, the sheriff's department would physically drag them and their belongings out to the curb. The truth hit me with the force of a freight train. The sudden aggressive demand for my 4-bedroom house had absolutely nothing to do with making room for a new baby. The calculated outrage at the restaurant, the moving truck showing up at my door, the stolen spare key, and the fraudulent petition to declare me legally incompetent. All of it, absolutely everything, was an act of pure, desperate survival. They weren't trying to upgrade their lifestyle. They were trying to steal my house because they were literally about to be thrown out on the street. The sheer depravity of their scheme weighed heavily on me. Flesh of my flesh had sat across from me at a fancy dinner, wearing a suit bought with stolen money, and he had tried to manipulate me out of the foundation I built with my own hands. He weaponized the emotional leverage of an unborn child to mask the fact that he was a failed, disgraced thief who could no longer put a roof over his family's head. This was the absolute peak of Derek's moral corruption. Growing up, I warned him about the dangers of living beyond his means. I taught him that a man's true worth isn't measured by the zip code of his apartment or the designer label on his wife's clothes. It's measured by his integrity and his ability to honor his debts. He ignored every single lesson I gave him. He chose the illusion of wealth over the reality of hard work. And when that illusion finally collapsed, instead of coming to me like a son asking for guidance or a temporary lifeline, he chose to treat me as a disposable asset. He decided that destroying my sanity, stripping me of my civil rights, and locking me in a psych ward was a perfectly acceptable price to pay to hide his own humiliating failures. I looked up at Sterling across the desk. The lawyer remained completely silent, giving me the space to process the magnitude of the betrayal. He knew as well as I did that this completely changed the landscape of our legal battle. Derek and Madison were cornered animals. They had no income, no credit, and no backup plan. That made them incredibly dangerous, but it also made them completely predictable. They thought they were hunting a vulnerable old man, but they had walked blindly into a trap of their own making. I felt no pity. The protective, fatherly instinct that usually softened my heart had been completely incinerated by their malice. If they wanted to play a cutthroat game of real estate and legal manipulation, I was going to show them how a master builder dismantles a structure from the inside out. I closed the file and slid it back across the desk. I told Sterling that defending against the conservatorship was no longer enough. I wanted to own their problem. Sterling leaned forward, his eyes shining with the predatory focus of a hardened litigator. I laid out my strategy. I didn't want to simply present these documents in family court to prove Derek was unfit as a guardian. That would only preserve my freedom. I wanted to establish absolute dominion over his immediate future. I instructed Sterling to immediately register an LLC under a highly generic corporate name. I authorized him to use a significant portion of my liquid savings to fund this new entity. With the shell company legally established and protected by strict layers of corporate privacy, Sterling reached out directly to the management group handling Derek's luxury apartment. Landlords dealing with high-value evictions are often eager to avoid the drawn-out, expensive, and messy process of a sheriff's lockout. They want to cut their losses and clear their books as fast as possible. My attorney made them a highly lucrative, entirely confidential offer. My anonymous LLC would buy the entirety of Derek's rental debt up front in cash. In exchange, the management group would legally transfer the collection rights and the active eviction order directly to my company. It took less than 48 hours of aggressive legal maneuvering and wire transfers to finalize the paperwork. The landlord was thrilled to wash their hands of the deadbeat tenants and recoup their lost revenue. Derek and Madison had absolutely no idea that the corporate entity which now owned their massive debt and their impending eviction notice was entirely controlled by the exact same man they were trying to lock in an asylum. I had legally purchased their desperation. I now held the absolute power to dictate exactly when and how they lost their home. I walked out of Sterling's office feeling a deep, chilling sense of control. The defensive phase of this war was officially over. I held the ultimate trump card, and I was willing to wait for the absolute perfect moment to play it for maximum impact. But while I was quietly securing my financial guillotine, Madison launched a vicious, highly public attack of her own. I woke up the next morning to a frantic phone call from a woman at my church. She told me I needed to check the internet immediately. I booted up my computer and found a video Madison had posted late the night before. It was already going viral in local community groups and neighborhood Facebook pages. She was sitting in front of the camera wearing an oversized sweater, clutching a tissue, and sobbing uncontrollably. She looked right into the lens and spun a highly produced, devastatingly manipulative story. She claimed that she and her husband were being ruthlessly attacked and abused by a hateful, prejudiced father-in-law. She weaponized her identity as a white woman expecting a mixed-race child, explicitly accusing me of reverse racism. She cried, saying I hated her solely because of her skin color, and that I had violently kicked her out of my home to ensure her baby would be born on the street. She completely omitted the stolen keys, the uninvited moving truck, and the fraudulent conservatorship lawsuit. The comments section was a terrifying explosion of outrage. Strangers from my own suburb were calling for my arrest, sharing my home address and demanding justice for the poor, oppressed, pregnant woman. The digital mob had been unleashed, and the court of public opinion was rapidly turning against me. The internet mob didn't wait for the facts. Within 24 hours of Madison uploading her tear-stained, expertly manipulated video, my quiet life in the suburbs was completely shattered. My phone battery drained continuously from the sheer volume of notifications, hate messages, and unhinged threats from complete strangers who had never even seen my face. They flooded community pages, calling me a bitter, racist old man who despised his own unborn grandson. They shared photos of my house, the very house I built with my own 2 hands, demanding that adult protective services step in and remove me from the property for my own good. When I stepped out onto my walkway the next morning to grab the paper, the atmosphere in my neighborhood had visibly shifted. Cars slowed down as they passed my property, drivers glaring at me with disgust through their windows. Carol, a woman who had lived across the street for 20 years and whose roof I had patched for free after a brutal storm. She quickly turned her head and hurried back inside her house when I waved at her. The isolation was immediate, heavy, and suffocating. I was suddenly a pariah in the very community I had spent decades helping to build. A 3-minute performance weaponizing fake tears had managed to erase 40 years of my spotless reputation. Madison knew exactly what she was doing. She understood that society is hardwired to instinctively protect a crying, vulnerable-looking pregnant woman, and she used that dangerous inherent bias to paint a massive target right on my back. The worst part wasn't the venom from anonymous internet trolls. It was the absolute arrogant satisfaction radiating from my son. Later that afternoon, Derek left a gloating voicemail on my phone. He didn't sound panicked or desperate anymore. He sounded triumphant. Drunk on the fake power of viral sympathy, he laughed into the receiver, telling me the court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. He bragged that I couldn't fight the entire internet, and that the judge overseeing our upcoming conservatorship hearing would undoubtedly view the public outrage as undeniable proof of my instability. He offered me one final, arrogant chance to hand over the house deed quietly before they took their smear campaign to the local news stations. Listening to his smug voice, a profound realization washed over me. I realized how terrifyingly fast a well-crafted lie can kill a man's honor. As a minority contractor starting out in the late 70s, I had to work 10 times harder than my white competitors just to be considered legitimate. I spent my entire adult life meticulously guarding my reputation, paying every supplier on time, honoring my word on every handshake, and proving my worth every single day. I built bulletproof prestige because I knew that in this world my integrity was the only currency they couldn't repossess, and yet my own son and his wife were casually destroying that lifetime of honor just to cover up their pathetic financial failures. They were willing to let strangers send me death threats just to steal my real estate. They felt invincible behind the glowing screens of their phones, convinced that their digital mob gave them absolute power. But they fundamentally misunderstood how true influence works in the real world. Internet outrage burns fast and furious, but at the end of the day it's hollow. True reputation has deep roots in the community, built on decades of face-to-face relationships, mutual respect, and quiet actions. I knew exactly how to use my real-world capital to dismantle their virtual lies. I didn't need to record a reaction video, scream into a camera, or fight with trolls in the comments. I needed to speak directly to the people who actually controlled the narrative in my neighborhood. I picked up my phone and made 2 very specific calls. I invited Pastor Ellis, the leader of the church I had attended for 30 years, and Carol, the president of our homeowners association, over for afternoon coffee and pastries. They accepted with a hesitant, uncomfortable tone, clearly torn between their lifelong respect for me and the scandalous rumors swirling online. When they arrived at my house, I greeted them with the same quiet, gentle hospitality Diane and I had always shown. We sat in the living room surrounded by the silent dignity of my home. I didn't bring up the viral video immediately, nor did I launch into a defensive, angry rant. Instead, I poured the coffee, asked about their families, and let the comfortable familiarity of our shared history ease the heavy tension in the room. Then I executed my strategy. I stood up, excusing myself to go to the kitchen to grab a plate of warm pastries. I intentionally left the thick legal dossier Sterling had prepared sitting right in the center of the mahogany coffee table. I had meticulously arranged the documents, so the most damning evidence was face up and impossible to ignore. Right on top was the official police report detailing Derek and Madison's break-in and their attempt to crack my safe. Directly underneath that was the formal eviction notice for their luxury apartment, highlighting in bold their 5 months of unpaid rent. And resting right beside it was the corporate termination letter exposing Derek's embezzlement at his former firm. I stayed in the kitchen for exactly 4 minutes. I took my time arranging the pastries on a platter, allowing human nature to take its course. When I returned, the atmosphere in the living room had completely transformed. Pastor Ellis was staring at the documents, pale with shock. Carol looked absolutely mortified, her eyes wide as she processed the undeniable truth printed in black and white. I set down the pastries, let out a sad, tired sigh, and apologized for leaving my private legal troubles out in the open. I quietly confessed to them that my son was in deep financial trouble, and that he was trying to force me out of my home to cover his debts, using the fake narrative of the pregnancy to manipulate the public. The effect was instantaneous. The gossip network of a church and an HOA operates with far more efficiency and credibility than any social media platform. Within 48 hours, the truth swept through our community like wildfire. The pastor and the neighbors mobilized, sharing the actual facts with everyone they knew. The narrative violently flipped. The comments on Madison's video shifted from blind support to fierce local backlash. People called out her lies, exposed Derek's eviction, and demanded she delete the deceptive video. The sudden, spectacular collapse of their public smear campaign pushed Derek into a dangerous, spiraling tailspin. He realized his social leverage hadn't just evaporated. His shameful financial ruin and corporate embezzlement were now public knowledge among the very people who used to respect him. His carefully constructed illusion of wealth and success was completely dead. That night, shortly after 2:00 a.m., the heavy, oppressive silence of my neighborhood was shattered by the violent, terrifying sound of breaking glass. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. I moved quickly to the window and peered through the blinds. Standing in my driveway, illuminated by the harsh glare of the street lamp, was my son. He was swaying heavily, clearly intoxicated, his face twisted into an ugly mask of unhinged rage. In his hands, he wielded a solid aluminum baseball bat. He raised it above his head and brought it crashing down on the windshield of my parked truck. Shards of safety glass exploded into the dark driveway. He was screaming my name into the quiet night, his voice echoing off the houses, demanding I come out and face him. The sharp, violent crunch of safety glass, shattering in the early hours of the morning, echoed like a gunshot. I stood by my bedroom window looking down. Derek took another wild, uncoordinated swing, with the aluminum bat smashing it into the hood of my truck. That truck wasn't just a vehicle. It was the first brand-new asset I bought with cash after securing my first major municipal contract. The dull thud of metal caving in under his drunken rage made my jaw clench. He stumbled backward, struggling to keep his balance on the concrete. He wasn't wearing his expensive suit jacket anymore. His dress shirt was untucked and heavily stained, and he screamed my name with a raw, guttural desperation. He roared into the quiet, residential street, demanding I open the door, demanding I give him the money he felt entitled to. He slurred his words, cursing me for exposing his eviction and corporate embezzlement to the church and the neighbors. He screamed that I had ruined his life, that I had humiliated his pregnant wife, and that I owed him my 4-bedroom house as compensation for his misery. The sheer volume of his tantrum was deafening. Lights flicked on in the houses next door. I could see Carol's silhouette standing behind her curtains, undoubtedly dialing 911, but I didn't want the police to intervene just yet. I needed to handle this confrontation on my own terms. I grabbed my heavy jacket, slid my arms through the sleeves, and unlocked the deadbolts on my front door. I stepped out onto the porch, bathed in the yellow glow of the security light. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, Derek snapped his attention toward the porch. He dropped the baseball bat onto the concrete with a loud metallic clatter and charged up the walkway. He took the steps 2 at a time. His face was twisted into a mask of pure alcohol-fueled fury. Before I could even brace my stance, he lunged forward and grabbed the thick fabric of my jacket with both hands. He shoved me hard against the brick facade of my own house. The impact knocked the wind out of my lungs for a brief second. Derek pulled himself close, his face inches from mine. The overpowering stench of cheap tequila and sour sweat radiated off him, a sickening contrast to the polished corporate executive he always pretended to be. He tightened his white-knuckled grip on my collar, his eyes bloodshot and erratic. He hissed through his teeth, threatening to destroy my life if I didn't sign the property deed over to him before sunrise. The tension on that porch was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Any neighbor watching from their window would have assumed a brutal physical brawl was about to erupt. My instincts, sharpened by decades working on rough job sites where physical altercations were common, screamed at me to fight back. Even at 69, I possessed the heavy, calloused strength of a man who had spent his life hauling lumber and pouring cement. I could have easily swept his legs, pinned him against the porch railing, and broken his arrogant jaw. My fists clenched tight at my sides. Every muscle in my body was coiled and ready to strike. It would have been incredibly satisfying to physically discipline the arrogant thief who currently had me pinned against my own house. But I forced my hands to open. I forced my muscles to relax. I knew that throwing punches with my son would give his lawyers exactly the ammunition they needed. If I laid a single finger on him, Madison would immediately claim I was a violent, unstable old man having a psychotic episode. I refused to hand them that victory. I needed him to dig his own grave, with his own words. I looked him dead in the eyes, completely unfazed by his aggressive posturing. I didn't fight his grip. Instead, I let a cold, mocking smile spread across my face. What my son didn't know was that just 48 hours ago, I had hired a professional security firm. They installed high-definition surveillance cameras around the entire perimeter of my property. Tucked perfectly out of sight under the eaves of the porch roof, a discreet lens was capturing incredibly clear 4K video. And most importantly, it was equipped with a highly sensitive directional microphone that was currently recording every single syllable spoken on that porch. I rested my head back against the brick wall and spoke in a calm, steady, and deliberately provocative tone. "You're going to beat me up for my real estate, Derek. Is that how desperate you are because you got fired for stealing?" I watched the muscle in his jaw twitch violently. I pushed harder, aiming right at his fragile ego. "You smashed my truck windows because you can't pay your own rent. You are a complete failure. You think grabbing an old man by the collar makes you powerful. You're nothing but a broke, pathetic beggar trying to rob his own father." The calculated insult worked perfectly. Derek lost his temper completely. His grip on my jacket tightened so hard the fabric began to tear. He shoved me violently against the wall, his face contorted with pure malice. He roared into the night air, his voice echoing perfectly into the hidden microphone above us. "I'm going to take everything from you. I am taking this house. I'm going to empty your bank accounts, and I'm taking every last cent you have left. If you don't sign those papers, I will forge them myself. I'll tell the judge you're completely insane. I'm taking it all, even if I have to lock you in a nut house to do it." He spat the words with absolute, undeniable clarity. It was a perfect, unfiltered confession of his entire fraudulent scheme. I had successfully goaded him into admitting his exact intent to falsely imprison me for profit. I smiled again, a genuine smile of victory, and simply told him to let go of my jacket. The distant wail of approaching police sirens finally pierced the night air. The sound snapped Derek out of his violent, drunken trance. He released my coat, stumbling backward down the porch steps, suddenly realizing the neighbors had actually called the cops. He took off running down the driveway, completely ignoring his baseball bat, and fled into the darkness just before two cruisers turned the corner. The police arrived, assessed the shattered glass on my truck, and asked if I wanted to press criminal charges for vandalism. I politely declined, citing it as a simple family misunderstanding. I didn't want Derek arrested for a minor property crime. I wanted him to feel confident enough to push forward with his conservatorship fraud, which was a massive federal offense. As soon as the police left, I downloaded the pristine video and audio silver bullet. I believed providing the court with crystal clear evidence of my son admitting to a fabricated psychiatric plot would instantly end their legal campaign. I was wrong. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived in my mailbox directly from the family court. Sterling called to explain the frustrating reality of the legal system. He warned me that judges who handle elder law are extremely conservative, because the conservatorship request was formally backed by sworn affidavits from Derek Madison and her parents. The court viewed the video of a drunken argument as just family drama. The judge ruled that legal procedure had to be followed strictly. The letter in my hand was a mandatory court order. I was officially required to attend a comprehensive psychological evaluation overseen by a court-appointed psychiatric specialist. If I didn't show up, I'd be held in contempt, and Derek would be granted temporary control of my estate by default. The trap I had set worked perfectly, but the system still demanded that I prove my sanity. Dr. Sullivan's waiting room was oppressively sterile, bathed in harsh fluorescent light that felt designed to cause a headache. I sat in a stiff leather chair, my hands resting quietly on my knees, waiting for the specialist to call my name. When I was finally led into his private office, the doctor didn't greet me with the polite, neutral professionalism you'd expect from an impartial medical examiner. He sat behind a massive glass desk, looking at me over the rim of his designer glasses. An arrogant, predetermined judgment was already locked in his eyes. Dr. Sullivan didn't start the evaluation with standard cognitive tests. He launched into a barrage of highly aggressive, manipulative questions explicitly designed to back me into a corner. He leaned forward, tapping his pen at a frantic pace on his yellow legal pad, and asked me why I harbored violent, paranoid delusions against my own flesh and blood. He twisted the events of the past few weeks with malicious precision. When I calmly explained that my son had smashed my truck windshield with a baseball bat, Dr. Sullivan condescendingly cut me off. He stated that according to the affidavit provided by my family, I had smashed my own vehicle in a state of severe dementia-induced confusion, and that Derek was simply trying to disarm me for my own safety. He asked me what year it was and then talked over me before I could answer, demanding to know why I had aggressively kicked a vulnerable pregnant woman out of my house. Every question was a linguistic trap. If I raised my voice to defend my honor, he would check the box for emotional volatility. If I remained completely silent, he would document cognitive unresponsiveness. He was actively trying to manufacture a medical diagnosis of insanity right in front of my eyes. The psychological pressure in that room was suffocating. I realized very quickly that this was not a fair, objective medical evaluation ordered by a blind justice system. This doctor was a hired gun, a mercenary in a white coat, operating as a direct extension of my son and his in-laws. There were massive stakes resting on the razor's edge of my composure. One miscalculated response, one moment of righteous anger, or one exhausted sigh would be legally coded as proof of a deteriorating mind. A single signature from this corrupt doctor would hand a judge the medical justification needed to strip me of my civil liberties. My entire life, the construction business I built from scratch, the money I meticulously saved, and the house Diane and I turned into a home would be instantly handed over to the very people trying to destroy me. I felt the familiar weight of being an older minority man, navigating a systemic structure that historically assumes our guilt and incompetence. I knew the medical system harbored the same dangerous biases as the courtrooms. I had to remain an impenetrable fortress of stoicism. Dr. Sullivan continued his assault, trying to disorient me by bringing up the exact date of Diane's death. firing rapid, overlapping questions about my grief, my financial decisions, and my daily routines. He wanted me to break. He wanted a tear, a tremor, or a shout. I looked him dead in the eye, slowing my breathing, calculating the exact timing of my responses. I gave him nothing but concise, factual, legally bulletproof answers, but internal discipline was only a temporary shield against a rigged game. I needed a decisive offensive strike to permanently shatter the legitimacy of this fraudulent evaluation. Just as Dr. Sullivan was smugly informing me that my defensive posture was highly indicative of paranoia, the heavy oak door of his private office swung wide open. I didn't flinch, but the doctor jumped in his chair. Attorney Sterling walked into the room with the imposing, lethal presence of an apex predator. He wasn't alone. Flanking my lawyer were three highly distinguished board-certified psychiatrists, including the former head of neurology from the State Medical University. These were the highest-ranking independent medical professionals in the region, a specialized medical board I had personally funded through my anonymous LLC specifically for this exact moment. Dr. Sullivan immediately stood up, his face red with indignation. He shouted that this was a closed-door, court-ordered evaluation and demanded they leave his private office immediately. Sterling didn't even blink. He walked right up to the glass desk and slammed a thick, glossy financial dossier right on top of Dr. Sullivan's legal pad. Sterling informed him in a voice dripping with legal menace that the independent board standing in the room had already conducted a comprehensive multi-hour psychological evaluation of my mental state earlier that week, entirely legally, and they had certified me as possessing exceptional cognitive function. Then, Sterling delivered the killing blow. He flipped the dossier open and pointed a long, firm finger at a highlighted wire transfer document. He announced loudly that his forensic investigator had tracked a very specific offshore wire transfer made exactly 48 hours ago. The document showed a direct deposit of $25,000 transferred to a shell company owned by Dr. Sullivan. The name on the originating account was Natalie's, using her maiden name in a pathetic attempt to hide the paper trail. Sterling looked the terrified doctor dead in the eyes. He promised to submit this undeniable proof of medical bribery and perjury to the State Medical Licensing Board before the sun went down. Dr. Sullivan collapsed into his chair, the color completely draining from his face, realizing his career was over in that very instant. The entire fraudulent conservatorship petition died right there in that sterile office. With their paid medical expert completely neutralized by undeniable proof of bribery, Derek and Madison had absolutely no legal ground to stand on. Sterling and I left the clinic and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, having successfully defended my freedom and completely dismantled their legal assault. But the war was evolving faster than we anticipated. As we reached my truck, Sterling's encrypted cell phone started vibrating aggressively. He answered, listening intently for almost a minute, his expression hardening into a look of absolute steel. He hung up and turned to me, his eyes sharp and focused. The private investigator had just intercepted a series of frantic, panic-stricken communications. Thomas and Natalie had gotten word that their bribed doctor was compromised and the conservatorship plot had imploded. They knew the legal blowback was going to hit them like a tidal wave. According to the investigator, the wealthy in-laws were in a state of complete hysteria. They were actively liquidating every single asset they could get their hands on, selling their vehicles below market value, draining their remaining retirement funds, and packing their bags. They weren't just bracing for a lawsuit. They were trying to flee the state, desperate to escape massive, dangerous gambling debts they owed to very unforgiving people. Sterling and I didn't celebrate our victory at the psych clinic. We drove immediately back to his secure downtown office to review the latest encrypted files sent by our PI. The investigator had been meticulously tracking the digital footprints of Thomas and Natalie's frantic attempts to liquidate their assets. But he stumbled onto a much darker financial anomaly, hidden deep within the bank records. He pulled up the detailed transaction history of the authorized user credit card Derek had stolen from my office. When I first saw the $50,000 drained from my account, I assumed it had all gone toward the imported Italian velvet sofa and Madison's luxury spa retreat. I was completely wrong. The investigator uncovered the true hidden destination of the majority of those stolen funds. Derek had executed a massive high-fee cash advance against my credit limit, siphoning the money through a complex series of untraceable digital payment platforms to obscure the trail. But the PI was a former federal agent who knew exactly how to follow the money. The funds didn't stay with Derek or Madison. The entire sum was wired directly to an offshore account, controlled by a notorious underground sports betting syndicate. The tens of thousands of dollars my son stole from my emergency reserve were used explicitly to pay off a violent, high-interest gambling debt, and the debt didn't even belong to Derek. The illicit account was registered under a discreet alias, tied directly to Thomas. My son had robbed his own father to save his father-in-law from having his legs broken by dangerous loan sharks. The absolute depravity of this entire family alliance was finally laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the law office. Thomas and Natalie weren't just financially irresponsible suburbanites trying to maintain a shallow country club facade. They were desperate, degenerate fraudsters drowning in the dangerous, unforgiving underworld of illegal gambling. The pristine golf attire, the rented designer bags, and the arrogant lectures about generational wealth were nothing but a fragile, desperate smokescreen meant to hide their rotting reality. Thomas had gambled away his retirement, his home equity, and his social standing. When the bookies started circling his property, threatening severe physical violence and public exposure, they panicked. They needed a massive influx of cash, and they needed it immediately. That was the true origin of this entire sickening conspiracy. Thomas and Natalie had colluded directly with Derek and Madison to target my estate. They orchestrated the hostile takeover of my 4-bedroom house, the fraudulent conservatorship lawsuit, and the aggressive psychological warfare, not to secure a safe environment for an unborn grandson, but to liquidate my real estate and save Thomas from the violent consequences of his own severe addiction. My son had completely abandoned his loyalty to me, choosing instead to protect the pathetic, decaying illusion of his white in-laws' upper-class lifestyle. He viewed the father who had sacrificed everything to raise him as nothing more than a convenient disposable ATM to pay off a betting syndicate. The harsh reality of their collusion tested the absolute limits of my composure. They had sat across from me in that upscale restaurant, looking me right in the eye, pretending to care about family values, while actively conspiring to strip me of my money to cover a gambling tab. They believed their proximity to wealth made them superior, untouchable, and entitled to the fruits of my life's labor. I felt a cold, dark wave of disgust wash over me. I had spent 40 years navigating the systemic traps designed to keep men like me in poverty, only to find the most dangerous predators sitting right inside my own living room. I looked across the heavy mahogany desk at Attorney Sterling. The seasoned litigator was already anticipating my next order, his pen hovering over a fresh legal pad. I didn't want to simply hand this mountain of evidence over to the local police and watch Thomas and Natalie flee the state to hide in obscurity. I wanted to personally own their destruction. I instructed Sterling to instantly mobilize the anonymous LLC we had previously used to buy out Derek's eviction notice. I wanted my corporate entity to swallow Thomas's financial existence whole. Sterling immediately reached out to his aggressive network of specialized debt brokers and corporate collection agencies. In the dark, cutthroat world of high-risk debt, bad paper is bought and sold every day for pennies on the dollar. Using my heavily shielded company, my lawyer aggressively negotiated the absolute buyout of Thomas's entire portfolio of defaulted loans, maxed-out credit lines, and outstanding markers. We even managed to buy the commercial debt he owed to regional casino affiliates who were preparing to sue him. I authorized the wire transfers from my secure accounts without a single second of hesitation. Within 48 hours, the complex legal paperwork was signed, sealed, and firmly in my possession. The anonymous company, completely controlled by me, was now the sole legal owner of every single dollar Thomas and Natalie owed to the world. I had officially become their ultimate master creditor. I held the absolute legal authority to garnish their wages, seize their remaining physical assets, freeze their bank accounts, and drag them into open court for devastating civil judgments. Right now, they were packing their bags, frantically trying to flee the state to escape their ruthless creditors, completely unaware that their primary creditor was now the exact same man they had tried to lock in a psych ward. I held the iron leash to their entire future, and I had wrapped it tight around their necks. I wasn't going to let them run away from the wreckage they had created. I was going to violently drag them back into the light and watch their fake empire crumble brick by brick, while I was quietly cementing my absolute financial dominion over both generations of this deceitful family. Madison remained blissfully and arrogantly unaware of the catastrophic death sentence hanging directly over her head. Believing the medical conservatorship was still moving forward and that her parents were successfully handling the legal fallout, she decided to double down on her fake, high society persona. My private investigator intercepted a digital invitation circulating among the wealthiest women in our area. Madison was throwing herself an obscenely lavish, wildly extravagant baby shower. Unable to use my locked credit cards, she had resorted to securing predatory high-interest loans and maxing out a handful of department store credit accounts to fund the massive spectacle. She rented the grand ballroom of a luxury downtown hotel, ordering custom-imported floral arrangements, a massive designer cake, and cases of expensive champagne. She was preparing to gather all her fake friends and wealthy acquaintances to celebrate a child, while sitting on a fragile throne built entirely out of fraudulent debt and pathetic lies. She had meticulously set the perfect stage for her own spectacular public execution, completely ignorant that I was standing right in the shadows holding the match. The grand ballroom of the hotel was a sickening display of prefabricated elegance. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, while massive floral arrangements of imported white roses and orchids dominated every table. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing the perfect soundtrack for a room full of affluent women sipping expensive champagne. In the center of it all was Madison, glowing in a custom-tailored designer maternity gown that cost more than most people make in a month. She held a crystal flute of sparkling cider, gently tapping it with a silver spoon to draw the attention of her 50 guests. When the room fell silent, she began her rehearsed performance. She placed a protective hand over her belly and delivered a tearful, perfectly calibrated speech about resilience. She spoke about the profound trials her growing family had recently faced, subtly hinting at the dark, toxic presence of an abusive father-in-law who had tried to throw them out on the street. She thanked her parents Thomas and Natalie, who were proudly standing by her side for being her absolute pillars of strength during such a harrowing emotional ordeal. She wiped away a single, elegant tear, praising her husband Derek for protecting their unborn child from a hateful, unstable old man. The audience gasped in synchronized sympathy, murmuring their support and offering pitying smiles. It was a masterclass in manipulation, a flawless theatrical play where the true villains were crowned as noble martyrs. I was standing just outside the heavy double doors of the ballroom, completely concealed by the shadows of the hallway, watching the entire grotesque spectacle unfold. The sheer unadulterated hypocrisy on display turned my stomach. Through the cracked doors, I watched men in tailored suits and women draped in fine jewelry raise their expensive crystal glasses to toast my son and his wife. They were drinking top-shelf champagne and dining on gourmet food, completely blind to the fact that the entire celebration was funded with stolen money, loan shark debt, and maxed-out credit cards. There stood Thomas and Natalie, beaming with their prefabricated aristocratic pride, accepting the admiration of the room as if they were the grand benefactors of this family. They played the role of the wealthy, protective grandparents to perfection. Not a single person in that lavish ballroom knew that the man smiling so warmly in his tailored polo was a degenerate gambler who owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to violent underground bookies. No one knew that the loving husband Derek, standing with his arm wrapped protectively around his wife, was a disgraced, fired embezzler who was exactly 14 days away from being physically thrown out of his apartment by the sheriff's department. They were all dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, convinced they were invincible because they had managed to temporarily silence an old minority contractor. I looked down at my hands, calloused and scarred from decades of hauling lumber, laying brick, and pouring concrete under the blistering sun. I had sacrificed my youth and my body to build a legitimate, honorable empire. They believed they could simply swoop in, declare me insane, and hijack my legacy to pay for their fake country club lives. They thought their zip codes and their polished vocabulary made them inherently superior and untouchable by the law. I adjusted the lapels of my charcoal grey suit, the exact same suit I wore when I dismantled Thomas at the country club. I felt not a single ounce of hesitation or mercy. I held 3 thick black leather binders in my left hand. Each one contained a legally binding death sentence for their social and financial lives. I waited for the applause following Madison's tearful speech to hit its absolute peak. Then I pushed the heavy oak doors wide open and stepped directly into the light. The heavy oak doors swung open with a dull, echoing thud that carried loudly over the string quartet. The music faltered and died. 50 pairs of eyes snapped toward the entrance. Madison's triumphant smile froze instantly, shattering like cheap glass. Derek took a sudden, terrified step backward, physically putting distance between himself and his wife. Thomas and Natalie went pale, the color draining from their faces so fast they looked like corpses. I didn't yell. I didn't rush. I walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom with the slow, deliberate cadence of an executioner. The wealthy guests parted like the Red Sea, murmuring in confusion as I approached the extravagant head table. I stopped directly in front of Madison, staring at her perfectly manicured hands trembling against her designer gown. I raised the 3 black leather binders and dropped them onto the table with a loud, heavy slam that made the fine china rattle. "I suggest you open your gifts," I said. My voice was deep, resonant, and carried to every corner of the dead silent ballroom. "Since your parents claim to be your financial saviors, let's show your guests exactly what kind of foundation your family is built on." I pointed at the first binder. "That is an official court-ordered eviction notice for Derek and Madison's luxury apartment, right alongside Derek's termination letter for corporate embezzlement. You have exactly 14 days before the sheriff throws your things on the curb." I moved my finger to the second binder, locking my eyes entirely on Thomas. "That is the legally transferred portfolio of Thomas's massive underground gambling debts. My company bought every single penny you owe to those loan sharks. I am your sole creditor now, Thomas, and I am calling the debt due immediately. Get ready to lose everything you own." The entire ballroom let out a collective gasp. A woman in the front row covered her mouth in absolute horror. I finally tapped the third binder, and that is the drafted criminal complaint detailing a $50,000 credit card fraud, identity theft, and a failed conspiracy to commit medical perjury. It will be filed with the district attorney first thing tomorrow morning. The absolute silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of Natalie letting out a choked, high-pitched sob. The wealthy guests, the very people Madison had tried so desperately to impress, offered zero sympathy. They recognized a toxic radioactive scandal the second they saw it. Within seconds, the collective embarrassment turned into a frantic mass exodus. Chairs scraped loudly against the floor as the affluent attendees grabbed their coats and purses, rushing toward the exit to avoid being associated with a family of disgraced criminals. In under 5 minutes, the grand ballroom was completely abandoned by the guests, leaving only a wasteland of half-finished champagne flutes and untouched gourmet foo. The pristine illusion of their high society family unit instantly disintegrated into a chaotic, savage violence. Without the audience to maintain their polite facade, the panic mutated into raw, ruthless rage. Thomas, his face completely purple with fury and terror over his exposed gambling debts, lunged forward and slapped Derek viciously across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the empty hall. "You worthless, pathetic failure," Thomas screamed, his voice cracking. "You promised you had this handled. You promised he was out of the way." Derek stumbled back, clutching his reddened cheek, but he didn't cower. He turned his explosive, unhinged anger directly toward Madison. He pointed a shaking finger at her, screaming that this was her fault. The fault of her greedy parents, and that her pathetic need to show off was dragging him into a federal prison cell. Madison screamed right back, her carefully styled hair flying wildly as she cursed her husband for being a useless, unemployed fraud. I stood a few feet away, watching them tear each other to pieces like rabid animals locked in a cage. I buttoned my suit jacket, turned my back on the miserable, screaming remains of their alliance, and walked out of the hotel. The public humiliation was complete, but I wasn't done. The final nail in their coffin was about to be delivered. The rhythmic drumming of rain against the roof of my 4-bedroom house matched the steady, relentless beating of my heart. I was sitting in my leather armchair, sipping a glass of fine-aged mezcal, allowing the absolute silence of my living room to wash over me after the chaotic spectacle at the downtown hotel. The digital clock above the mantel read just past midnight, when the frantic, desperate pounding started on my front door. I didn't rush. I picked up my cell phone and pulled up the high-definition security camera feed. Standing on my porch, completely drenched by the freezing torrential downpour, was Derek. His tailored suit, the exact same one he wore while standing proudly at his fraudulent baby shower, was soaked through and plastered to his skin. He was no longer standing tall with the arrogance of a corporate manager. My 3-2-year-old son was physically on his knees, shivering against the biting wind, pressing his face against the heavy oak wood of my door. I set down my glass, walked into the hallway, and pulled the door open. Derek fell forward over the threshold, crying with loud, ugly, guttural sobs. He didn't demand anything this time. He looked up at me with red, swollen eyes and immediately started frantically shifting the blame. He swore that the entire conservatorship plot, the stolen credit cards, and the hostile takeover of my property had been orchestrated entirely by Madison and her parents. He claimed he was just a desperate, terrified pawn trapped in their web of debt, completely manipulated by the wealthy white family he had married into. He begged for my forgiveness, pleading for me to let him inside, insisting he had finally seen their true colors and that he wanted his real dad back. Looking down at my son, shivering on the wet hardwood floor of my entryway, a fleeting, dangerous flash of paternal instinct flared in my chest. For a fraction of a second, the towering, disgraced embezzler vanished, and I saw the little boy I used to take to job sites on Saturday mornings. I remembered teaching him how to read a tape measure, how to swing a hammer, and how to carry himself with the pride of a man who earned every single thing he owned. Seeing him reduced to a pathetic, weeping mess on the floor genuinely hurt. It was the tragic, undeniable pain of a father witnessing the ultimate failure of his own flesh and blood. Derek, possessing the cunning instincts of a cornered animal, immediately sensed that microscopic hesitation in my posture. He lunged forward, grabbing the hem of my trousers with wet, shaking hands, and deployed the most manipulative weapon left in his arsenal. He brought up the unborn baby. He cried that he was about to be a father, and that his son was going to be born into a nightmare of bankruptcy and criminal investigations. He begged me to think of our family name's legacy. He promised that if I just withdrew the criminal complaint, forgave the gambling debt, and let him stay in his childhood bedroom, he would divorce Madison immediately. He swore he would fight for full custody of the baby and raise my grandson right here in this house, far away from the toxic, rotting influence of Thomas and Natalie. He painted a desperate, emotional picture of a redeemed son and a loving grandfather raising the next generation together, united against the deceitful in-laws. He pleaded that the innocent child in Madison's belly didn't deserve to pay for the sins of its mother or the desperate mistakes of its father. He wailed that the baby would be homeless by the end of the month, that it would be born in a charity hospital, because the sheriff was going to evict them from the luxury apartment. He clawed at my empathy, demanding I overlook decades of his arrogance and deception for the sake of a child who hadn't even taken its first breath. I didn't reach down to help him up. I didn't offer him a dry towel or a hot cup of coffee. I looked at the man clinging to my pant leg, and I felt the absolute last ember of my fatherly compassion go entirely cold. His willingness to instantly throw his pregnant wife to the wolves, offering to abandon her and steal her child just to save his own skin from a fraud conviction, confirmed exactly how utterly devoid of morality my son had become. He wasn't a victim of Madison's manipulation. He was a willing, enthusiastic participant who was only sorry because he got caught. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my cell phone, and opened the security app. I didn't raise my voice or offer a passionate sermon about family values. I simply hit play and turned the volume all the way up. The crisp, high-definition audio from the night he smashed my truck windshield echoed loudly in the quiet entryway. Derek's own drunken, venomous voice filled the air, screaming with absolute malice. "I'm going to take everything from you. I am taking this house. I'm going to empty your bank accounts, and I'm taking every last cent you have left. If you don't sign those papers, I will forge them myself. I'll tell the judge. You're completely insane. I'm taking it all, even if I have to lock you in. A nut house to do it." The recording stopped, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the hallway, save for the sound of the rain falling outside. Derek froze, his hands slowly slipping off my trousers. The color drained from his tear-streaked face as he realized the depth of his own fatal mistake. "You weren't manipulated, Derek," I said, my voice ringing with an unshakable, absolute finality. "You chose to betray me. You chose to try and destroy my mind and steal my wealth to cover up your pathetic failures. Greed isn't something you caught from your in-laws. That corruption is in your own blood. You are a coward. You are a thief, and you are absolutely no son of mine." I stepped backward, breaking the physical connection between us, and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the oak door. I looked down at him one last time, shivering on the wet porch, and slammed the door shut. I engaged all 3 deadbolts, leaving him sealed outside in the freezing rain where he belonged. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the neighborhood washed and clean under the bright sunlight. I sat in my kitchen drinking my black coffee, feeling an unexpected sense of deep, undeniable peace. The emotional tumor had been completely excised. I had finally accepted the reality of who Derek was, detaching myself entirely from the toxic obligation of blind fatherly loyalty. I was ready to let the district attorney and the civil courts systematically dismantle what was left of their miserable lives. But the universe wasn't done exposing the absolute depths of their depravity. At exactly 9:00 a.m. my cell phone rang. It was Attorney Sterling. The seasoned, unflappable lawyer sounded uncharacteristically urgent, his voice tight, with a mix of shock and professional adrenaline. He told me our private investigator had just executed a preliminary subpoena on Madison's recent medical expenses, hoping to track the fraudulent credit card charges to specific prenatal clinics for the criminal complaint. What the investigator found buried in the billing codes of the hospital servers wasn't just evidence of financial fraud. Sterling took a deep breath over the line and told me there was a massive, horrifying anomaly in her medical records. The unborn grandson Derek had used as a human shield on my porch the night before was the center of their darkest, sickest secret. The billing codes our investigator managed to pull via the subpoena painted a chilling, undeniably clear picture of absolute medical fraud. Madison was not pregnant. According to the strictly confidential clinical data sitting firmly on my lawyer's desk, she had tragically suffered a miscarriage over 5 months ago. There were very specific billing records for a standard medical procedure related to the loss, but the paper trail completely and abruptly vanished right there. There were no ongoing prenatal checkups, no recent ultrasound appointments, no blood work, and absolutely no OBGYN bills filed since that date. The woman who had stood in the center of that grand hotel ballroom, gently cradling her belly and weeping softly over the safety of her unborn child, was wearing a silicone prosthetic bump. She had weaponized a phantom pregnancy to create a fake ticking clock. She knew simply asking for a 4-bedroom house to cover her husband's financial ruin would never work. But presenting herself as a vulnerable, crying mother who needed an immediate nursery for a baby due in a few short months provided the perfect emotional battering ram. She had used a fake baby to try and break down my boundaries, forcing a rapid, unquestioned transfer of my deed before the truth could be discovered. The sheer sociopathic scale of this deception crossed every imaginable moral boundary. I sat at my kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall, struggling to comprehend the absolute darkness required to orchestrate a lie of that magnitude. To stand in front of your family, your friends, and your community accepting expensive gifts and profound sympathy for a child that simply did not exist required a level of cold-blooded malice that genuinely terrified me. But as the initial shock slowly subsided, a different, far more pathetic realization began to take shape in my mind. Derek didn't know. My son was a thief, an embezzler, and a coward, perfectly willing to lock his own father in a psych ward to cover his dangerous gambling debts. But he was also a spectacularly manipulated fool. He genuinely believed he was fighting tooth and nail to secure a safe roof over his future child's head. Madison had played him with surgical, devastating precision. She recognized his arrogant desperation regarding his job loss and impending eviction, and she actively fed it, twisting his panic into a weapon she could aim directly at my estate. Thomas and Natalie likely knew the absolute truth, helping their daughter maintain the sickening illusion of a perfect, expanding upper-class family to save themselves from their own underground loan sharks. Derek had thrown away his corporate career, completely alienated his father, and risked a massive federal fraud conviction, all to protect a woman who was actively deceiving him every single time she strapped on that fake belly in the morning. He had destroyed his entire life and legacy for an absolute mirage. The irony was heavy and suffocating. My son believed he was the brilliant mastermind of a real estate heist, but he was nothing more than a pathetic, disposable pawn in his wife's psychotic, theatrical production. The old Eugene, the father who still clung to a microscopic thread of hope for his boy, might have picked up the phone. He might have called to warn him about the monster he married. He might have tried to soften the devastating blow of losing a child he believed was still on the way. But that father died the moment Derek grabbed my winter coat on the porch and explicitly threatened to forge my medical records. I didn't owe him a comforting conversation, and I absolutely refused to give Madison the chance to intercept the information and spin a complex new web of lies to save herself. I instructed Sterling to compile a certified, irrefutable dossier containing the subpoenaed medical billing records. I wanted the specific dates, the medical procedures, and the absolute lack of ongoing obstetric care highlighted in bright yellow ink. I didn't include a personal note. I didn't add a single word of fatherly commentary. The cold, sterile medical facts were brutal enough on their own. Sterling hired a specialized, certified legal courier, the exact kind used to serve high-level corporate lawsuits. I gave the courier explicit, non-negotiable instructions. The heavy, sealed envelope was to be delivered directly to Derek at his luxury apartment, and it had to be physically placed into his own 2 hands. I expressly forbade leaving it with the building's concierge, and I absolutely prohibited handing it to his wife under any circumstances. I paid double the standard rate for urgent real-time tracking service. I sat in my living room watching the digital tracking link on my cell phone update with the cold precision of a demolition expert waiting for the timer to hit 0. At exactly 2:00 p.m., the tracking status updated to delivered. Digital signature required. Derek had the papers. The undeniable truth was officially inside their crumbling, debt-ridden apartment. I set my phone down, poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee, and waited for the inevitable explosion. I didn't have to wait long at all. Less than an hour after the courier confirmed successful delivery, my private investigator sent me a frantic, real-time text update. He had been discreetly surveilling the perimeter of their luxury building, waiting to assess any potential collateral damage. The explosion wasn't just metaphorical. It was a terrifying, violently physical eruption. According to the investigator on site, a horrendous domestic brawl had just erupted on the 12th floor. The deafening sounds of heavy furniture being smashed against walls and glass shattering violently echoed all the way out into the pristine public hallways. Terrified neighbors were flooding the building management switchboard with emergency noise complaints. Derek was screaming at the absolute top of his lungs, his voice completely unhinged and raspy, tearing through the quiet halls of the luxury complex. Minutes later, the sharp, piercing wail of approaching sirens cut through the busy downtown streets. Two police cruisers braked aggressively right in front of the lobby's glass doors, armed officers sprinting into the building. The fragile, fake empire they had built together was finally burning to the ground. The ringtone of my cell phone sliced through the quiet, heavy atmosphere of my living room. It wasn't a text from my PI or an update from my lawyer. The caller ID on the screen displayed the unmistakable letters of the local police precinct. I answered the call with the steady, measured breathing of a man who already knew exactly what the voice on the other end was going to say. A desk sergeant introduced himself, his tone thick with that tired authority specific to an officer dealing with a messy, violent domestic disturbance. He officially informed me that my son Derek had just been taken into custody and was currently sitting in a holding cell at the downtown precinct. The sergeant described a scene of absolute unhinged devastation. According to the responding officers in the police report, Derek had completely lost his mind upon reading the certified medical documents I sent. He had systematically and ruthlessly destroyed his luxury apartment. He shattered the floor-to-ceiling mirrors, splintered his expensive imported furniture, and reportedly threw Madison's silicone prosthetic belly straight through a glass balcony door. The 12th-floor neighbors had jammed the emergency lines, terrified by the screaming and the sounds of heavy destruction. When the officers breached the apartment doors, they found Derek in a state of blind, hysterical rage. Surrounded by the rubble of his fake life, he was immediately subdued, read his rights, and booked on multiple felony charges. The list included severe destruction of property, disturbing the peace, and domestic violence. The polished illusion of my son as an untouchable, sophisticated corporate executive was officially dead, instantly replaced by the sad mugshot of a violent, disgraced vandal sitting behind bars. But the most staggering part of the evening wasn't Derek's predictable, explosive meltdown. It was Madison's venomous immediate pivot. The woman was a true, calculating sociopath, completely incapable of feeling shame or remorse. Even as her husband was being handcuffed and dragged out of their ruined apartment by armed police officers, she was already executing her next financial survival strategy. Within hours of the arrest, my private investigator intercepted a flurry of urgent, desperate legal filings. Madison didn't waste a single second playing her absolute favorite role. She immediately filed for an emergency restraining order against Derek, painting herself to the courts as the terrified, traumatized victim of an abusive, unpredictable monster. But she didn't stop there. Before the sun came up the next morning, she officially filed for a highly contentious divorce. The legal demands she submitted in her paperwork were nothing short of a masterpiece of delusion. She aggressively demanded maximum spousal support, lifetime alimony, and a mandatory 50% split of their marital assets. I sat at my kitchen table the next morning reading the preliminary divorce filings my lawyer had forwarded to me, and truthfully I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Madison was aggressively demanding half of a financial black hole. She was fiercely negotiating for her share of a corporate salary that no longer existed because Derek had been fired for embezzlement. She wanted the equity from a luxury apartment that was weeks behind on rent and actively under an eviction order held by my anonymous LLC. She was completely oblivious to the fact that the man she was trying to bleed dry was drowning in a catastrophic ocean of debt. She hired a high-priced vulture of a divorce attorney using a predatory line of credit, foolishly believing she could somehow use the family courts to legally siphon my money through Derek. Her relentless greed blinded her to the harsh reality that she was chaining herself to a rapidly sinking anchor. The police sergeant on the phone cleared his throat, bringing my attention back to the present moment in my quiet living room. He told me Derek had used his single legally permitted phone call from the booking area to contact the precinct desk, desperately begging the officers to reach out to his wealthy father. The sergeant asked me the ultimate question, his voice carrying a slight hint of expectation. He asked if I would be coming down to the precinct tonight to post bail and arrange private legal defense for my son. I held the phone to my ear, letting the heavy silence stretch across the line. Decades of memories flashed through my mind in rapid succession. I remembered bailing Derek out of a minor traffic scrape when he was an arrogant teenager. I remembered paying his expensive college tuition, buying his first reliable car, and handing him a hefty cash down payment for his first condo. I had spent my entire adult life acting as his permanent unconditional safety net, shielding him from the harsh consequences of his own actions. But the man sitting in that holding cell wasn't a misguided youth making a simple mistake. He was a malicious, arrogant adult who had actively conspired to strip me of my civil rights, steal the house I built with his late mother, and lock me in a psych ward just to cover up his own pathetic failures. He had brought this absolute, undeniable destruction entirely upon himself. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the final thread of paternal obligation snap cleanly in two. I spoke into the receiver with a chilling, absolute calm that left no room for negotiation. I told the sergeant I would not be posting any bail, nor would I be sending a defense attorney to the precinct. I stated clearly, his behavior is not my problem. I hung up the phone without waiting for a response, severing the connection and leaving my son to spend the night shivering on a cold concrete bench, while Derek was abandoned in a holding cell and Madison spun her desperate web of divorce lies. The final shockwave at last hit her parents. Stripped of the financial backing of their fake high society daughter, and realizing the conservatorship plot had completely failed, Thomas and Natalie were left entirely defenseless. The legal machinations of my LLC hit them with a terrifying, inescapable speed. Without the promised influx of cash from my stolen real estate, their violent underground creditors closed in rapidly. The next morning, aggressive repo agents arrived at their pristine suburban home with flatbed tow trucks. The disgraced couple was forced to frantically hand over the keys to their leased luxury cars to avoid immediate criminal charges for fraud. With the neighbors watching from their windows, Thomas and Natalie packed their remaining designer clothes into a couple of suitcases and fled their affluent zip code in absolute, undeniable disgrace. They were forced to relocate to a cheap, run-down motel in a dangerous, blighted part of the city, desperately hiding from the loan sharks they had tried to pay off with my money. But their nightmare was just beginning. They had no idea that my corporate entity had officially filed the final asset seizure order, a legal death sentence hovering right above their heads, ready to strip them of the very last penny they owned. I sat on the polished wooden bench of the courthouse wearing the exact same charcoal gray suit I wore when I first dismantled Thomas at the country club. The courthouse air conditioning was blasted on high, but the chill in the room radiated entirely from the defense table. The long-awaited criminal fraud, identity theft, and severe elder financial abuse trial had officially begun. Derek was escorted in. His corporate arrogance had been completely replaced by the trembling, exhausted posture of a man who had spent the last few weeks bouncing between holding cells and cheap bail bondsmen. Sitting a few feet away at the same defense table, actively avoiding any eye contact with her husband, was Madison. She had traded her extravagant designer maternity gowns for a simple conservative blouse, attempting to look as unassuming and harmless as possible. Right behind them, sitting in the gallery pews, were Thomas and Natalie. They looked absolutely haggard, their country club tans fading into a sickly, stressed pallor as they hid from the debt collectors waiting for them outside. The district attorney stood before the judge and delivered an opening statement that cut through the silence like a scalpel. He didn't paint this as a simple family misunderstanding. He methodically laid out a cruel, coordinated criminal conspiracy designed to exploit, medically gaslight, and financially ruin a 9-year-old widower. He detailed the stolen credit cards, the wire transfers to illegal betting syndicates, and the sociopathic fabrication of a pregnancy used as a weapon for real estate extortion. I watched the faces of the jurors as the sheer calculated depravity of my son and his in-laws was laid completely bare. There was no pity in their eyes, only a deep, unmistakable disgust. When it came time for the defense to present their case, the desperation in the room hit a fever pitch. Madison's overpriced divorce attorney, acting as her criminal counsel, immediately tried to throw Derek entirely under the bus. He paraded Madison in front of the jury, prompting her to squeeze out a few pathetic, rehearsed tears. She testified that she was a terrified, manipulated housewife who had no idea her husband was embezzling corporate funds or stealing from his elderly father. She claimed Derek forced her to wear the silicone belly to secure housing because he became physically abusive when his financial schemes failed. Derek's public defender retaliated with the same viciousness, arguing that Derek suffered from severe mental breakdowns caused by the intense manipulative pressure of his wealthy white in-laws, who demanded he maintain a lifestyle of luxury. They pointed fingers at each other, tearing themselves apart right there on the witness stand, desperately trying to salvage an ounce of sympathy from the jury. But their theatrical performances were completely shattered the moment the prosecutor began presenting the hard, undeniable forensic evidence my legal team had meticulously compiled. The DA projected the wire transfer documents onto a massive screen, explicitly showing the tens of thousands of dollars moving directly from my stolen credit card through a shell account and straight into the hands of Thomas's violent underground bookies. The paper trail was absolute. There was no plausible deniability. Then the prosecutor played the high-definition audio recording from my porch. Derek's drunken, venomous voice echoed through the sterile courtroom, screaming his exact intent to forge psychiatric papers and lock me in a madhouse to steal my real estate. The jury physically recoiled at the sheer malice in his voice. Finally, the prosecutor presented the certified medical subpoena, proving that Madison had not been pregnant for over 5 months, exposing her elaborate sociopathic fraud to the entire room. The defense attorneys stopped objecting. They leaned back in their chairs, completely defeated by the sheer volume of irrefutable, deeply incriminating evidence. The unholy alliance had tried to play the victims, but the digital receipts and audio recordings exposed them as nothing more than ruthless, calculating predators. The jury didn't even need a full afternoon to deliberate. They returned with a unanimous, devastating verdict: guilty on all counts. The presiding judge, a stern older woman who had zero tolerance for elder exploitation, looked down at the defense table with absolute contempt. She delivered a scathing, humiliating reprimand that bounced off the courtroom walls, dismantling their fabricated entitlement, piece by piece. She explicitly stated that in her 30 years on the bench, she had rarely seen a family unit so completely devoid of basic human morality. She handed down the sentences with the heavy, unshakable strike of her gavel. Derek and Madison were formally convicted of felony identity theft, financial fraud, and criminal conspiracy to ensure they couldn't simply rot in a county jail cell on the taxpayer's dime. The judge strategically suspended their immediate prison sentences in favor of 5 years of maximum security, heavily monitored probation. However, this probation came with a crushing, inescapable mandate. She ordered them to pay full and complete financial restitution to me, down to the very last stolen penny, including all my extensive legal fees. If they missed a single scheduled payment, their probation would be instantly revoked and they would be thrown straight into a state penitentiary. Furthermore, whatever remaining assets they had were legally seized. The judge's ruling meant they would be working grueling minimum wage jobs for the next half-decade, solely to pay back the father they had tried to destroy. Thomas and Natalie, sitting in the back pews, realized their fate was equally sealed. My anonymous LLC officially finalized the civil judgments against them that very same afternoon, seizing their remaining bank accounts and forcing them into absolute catastrophic bankruptcy. The luxurious, untouchable empire they believed they were entitled to was officially reduced to ash. The sinister alliance between my son, his manipulative wife, and her fraudulent parents was completely and permanently annihilated. They walked out of that courtroom as convicted felons and penniless debtors, stripped of their pride, their property, and their future. I sat on my bench feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the last few months finally lift off my shoulders. The system had actually worked, driven entirely by my refusal to be a silent victim. I walked out through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse and stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight alongside Attorney Sterling. We exchanged a firm, respectful handshake, acknowledging the absolute flawless victory we had just secured. I walked across the vast concrete parking lot toward my newly repaired truck, ready to drive home, and finally enjoy the deep silence of my property. But as I reached for the driver's side door, a figure stepped out from behind the adjacent vehicle, physically blocking my path to the seat. It was Derek. He was no longer wearing the jail jumpsuit, having been formally processed out onto his highly restrictive probation, but he looked completely hollowed out. He was trembling. His shoulders were slumped in an absolute defeat with nowhere left to go. The luxury apartment was gone. His wife hated him, and his career was permanently erased. He looked up at me with tired, bloodshot eyes and begged for a single night on my living room couch. He whispered that he was completely on the street, that he had less than $20 in his pocket, and was facing the terrifying reality of sleeping on the dangerous city streets tonight. I stood perfectly still on the burning asphalt of the courthouse parking lot, staring at the pathetic shaking shell of the man I had raised. Derek held out a trembling hand, his bloodshot eyes wide, with a genuine, unadulterated terror he had not experienced a single day in his privileged life. He pleaded for just 12 hours of shelter. He promised he would sleep on the floor, that he would be gone long before sunrise, and that he just needed a safe place to figure out his next move. The sheer blinding audacity of his request, asking for sanctuary in the exact same 4-bedroom house he had tried to steal by locking me in a psychiatric ward, was staggering. I looked at the sweat and grime streaking his face. There was a time when a single tear from my boy would have made me move mountains to fix his world. But the father who would have saved him died the night Derek stood on my porch and threatened to forge my medical records to secure his inheritance. I didn't offer him a parting sermon, nor did I raise my voice to mock his spectacular downfall. I simply looked him dead in the eyes and slowly, definitively shook my head. I reached out, firmly removed his hand from the door handle of my truck and climbed into the driver's seat. I fired up the heavy engine, and the familiar, powerful roar vibrated through the cab. Derek stumbled backward, his mouth falling open in absolute, inaudible disbelief as I shifted into gear. I pulled out of the parking space, leaving my 3-2-year-old son standing completely alone in the massive empty lot. I didn't check the rearview mirror a single time as I merged onto the busy main avenue. The drive back to my quiet suburb was the longest and heaviest of my entire life. The silence inside the cab of my truck was absolute, but my mind was a chaotic, punishing storm of grief and finality. Cutting off your own flesh and blood is never a victorious or triumphant feeling. It feels like performing an amputation on yourself without anesthesia to stop a lethal infection from reaching your heart. It leaves a massive phantom ache that you know will linger in the background for the rest of your days. I parked in the driveway and walked through the solid oak front door I had installed myself decades ago. The house was completely empty, echoing with the ghosts of past Christmases, Sunday dinners, and the booming laughter of a family unit that no longer existed. I walked into the kitchen and sat at the table where Diane and I had spent thousands of hours planning Derek's future. We had poured every ounce of our energy, our financial resources, and our unconditional love into ensuring he never had to struggle the way we did. We shielded him from the harsh, prejudiced realities of the world, hoping to raise a strong, independent man of color. Instead, our overprotection created a fragile, entitled parasite who believed he could simply cannibalize his elders when his own poor choices caught up with him. As I sat in the quiet twilight of my living room, the profound emptiness began to morph into a raw, undeniable clarity. If I allowed myself to be anchored by the guilt of a father mourning a failed son, I would never truly escape the psychological prison they had tried to build for me. The only way to survive this ultimate betrayal was to completely sever the physical tethers to that painful past. This 4-bedroom house built with blood and sweat had become the toxic obsession that triggered my son's malice. It was no longer a peaceful sanctuary. It was a standing monument to his greed. I realized that keeping the property was keeping the wound wide open. To truly experience a rebirth, I needed to liquidate the very prize they had fought so ruthlessly to steal. The next morning, I didn't call a commercial real estate broker. I reached out directly to a prominent, highly respected foundation for vulnerable youth operating right in the heart of our city. It was a charity dedicated to providing safe transitional housing and intensive mentorship for at-risk homeless young men. I invited their board of directors to tour my property privately. When they saw the sprawling square footage, the solid, immaculate foundation, and the massive, secure backyard, they were overwhelmed by the potential. But they cautiously admitted that a pristine 4-bedroom home in this specific zip code was wildly out of their NGO's budget. I sat down with their lead director and offered them an immediate private off-market sale at a massive, undeniably generous discount. I slashed the asking price to a mere fraction of its market value, structuring the sale as a partial philanthropic donation. My only condition was that the transaction be finalized quickly and that the house be used exclusively as a permanent sanctuary for young men who truly needed a firm foundation to build their lives. The board accepted immediately with tears of genuine gratitude in their eyes. Over the next 2 weeks, I systematically packed up 40 years of history. I carefully boxed up Diane's cherished book collection, her delicate porcelain figures, and the framed photographs of a younger, happier time. I went through my heavy contractor tools, donating the vast majority of them directly to the charity's vocational trades program. As I taped up the final cardboard box, I felt a massive, powerful wave of liberation. I was taking the exact asset that had corrupted my son and transforming it into a vital lifeline for young men who would actually appreciate the incredible value of a safe home. The transaction closed flawlessly, transferring the deed completely out of my name and placing the property permanently into an untouchable charitable trust. The kingdom Derek had tried to conquer was officially gone. A week after closing, the local community newspaper ran a prominent, highly flattering front-page feature on the Charity Foundation's newest acquisition. The article highlighted the massive philanthropic discount I had provided and featured a high-resolution photograph of the sprawling 4-bedroom home, now officially dedicated as the Eugene and Diane Youth Sanctuary. Down at the county probation office, Derek was sitting in a dreary, fluorescent-lit waiting room, waiting to check in with his strict parole officer before heading back to a cramped, miserable bunk at the city men's shelter. He picked up a discarded copy of that exact same newspaper someone had left on a plastic chair. He casually flipped to the front page and froze instantly. His sunken, exhausted eyes locked onto the image of his childhood home, the very property he had committed federal felonies to try and steal. Reading the headline detailing the permanent transfer of the multi-million-dollar estate into an untouchable charitable trust, the crushing, inescapable reality of his actions finally hit him. He hadn't just lost a legal battle. He had single-handedly, systematically, and with his own 2 hands, burned his guaranteed generational inheritance straight to the ground. The vibration of my cell phone broke the quiet, settled peace of my temporary condo. I had recently relocated to an exclusive high-security building downtown while finalizing my long-term living arrangements, enjoying the absolute tranquility that comes with total financial independence. I glanced at the glowing caller ID on the screen. It was an unknown local number, likely a payphone or a prepaid landline. I answered fully, expecting a call from the Charity Foundation's legal team to wrap up some minor administrative details regarding the final deed transfer. Instead, the ragged, heavy breathing on the other end of the line instantly told me exactly who was calling. It was Derek. He was calling from whatever run-down halfway house or cheap motel his strict parole officer had approved for his mandatory registered address. He had clearly just finished reading the front page of the local paper. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was doing or apologize for his actions. He bypassed any pretense of a normal conversation and immediately launched into a hysterical, sob-filled rant. His voice echoed with a toxic, terrifying mix of absolute devastation and venomous hatred. He screamed at me through the receiver, demanding to know why I was so unbelievably cruel. He cried that I had taken his last remaining safety net in this world and maliciously handed it over to a bunch of complete strangers just to spite him. He yelled that he was currently sleeping on a stained mattress in a tiny room that smelled like bleach and desperation, surrounded by dangerous strangers, while I was walking around playing the generous, celebrated neighborhood philanthropist. He asked me how a father could be so completely heartless, so flat-out vindictive as to permanently disinherit his own flesh and blood when he was already at absolute rock bottom. He sobbed uncontrollably into the phone, claiming I had actively and intentionally destroyed his last thread of hope. I sat in my comfortable leather armchair by the window, holding the phone to my ear, listening to the agonizing sound of a 3-2-year-old man completely consumed by his own delusional victimhood. Even after standing in a criminal courtroom, even after receiving a felony conviction and a suspended prison sentence, Derek had absolutely zero capacity for genuine self-reflection. He spent the next 5 minutes delivering a frantic, breathless monologue of pure deflection. He refused to take an ounce of responsibility. He blamed his staggering financial ruin entirely on Madison, claiming her insatiable appetite for designer brands and luxury vacations forced him to steal from his company to keep her happy. He blamed Thomas and Natalie for dragging him into their violent underworld gambling debts, insisting he was just a naive, desperate husband trying to protect his marriage from loan sharks. And finally, with breathtaking, unbelievable audacity, he blamed me. He told me that if I had just quietly signed the house deed over to him in that fancy restaurant months ago, none of this nightmare would have ever happened. He argued that my stubborn pride and selfish refusal to step aside for the next generation forced him to take extreme, desperate legal measures. He actually managed to convince himself that the fraudulent conservatorship, the stolen credit cards, and the psychiatric conspiracy were my fault for refusing to be a docile, silent victim. He cried that I had deliberately set him up to fail. He whined about the agonizing reality of his mandatory probation, complaining bitterly about the random drug tests, the humiliating minimum wage labor he was forced to do just to pay me the judge-ordered restitution, and the terrifying prospect of spending the next 5 years of his life walking on a tightrope. He wanted me to feel a crushing, unbearable guilt for the consequences he brought upon himself. He desperately wanted me to apologize for defending my own life. He wanted me to swoop in, void the massive charity donation, and magically restore his status as a wealthy, entitled heir. He was a spectacular failure who absolutely refused to look in the mirror, permanently trapped in the toxic illusion that the entire universe owed him a life of luxury he had never earned. I let him finish his frantic, pathetic rant. I didn't interrupt his sobs, and I didn't raise my voice to match his hysterical, elevated pitch. When he finally ran out of breath, leaving only the sound of static and his heavy, defeated panting on the line, I spoke. My voice was incredibly calm, dropping to a low, resonant pitch that conveyed absolute, unshakable finality. I told him I had spent 40 years of my life breaking my back on dangerous construction sites, swallowing my pride in rooms full of prejudiced men and bleeding for every dollar I earned, all so he could have a massive head start in life. I reminded him that I taught him to be a proud, self-reliant, honorable man of color in a world that would happily watch him fail. I gave him the absolute best foundation any father could possibly provide. But he took that foundation, decided it wasn't glamorous enough for his shallow tastes, and chose to become a hollow, parasitic fraud. I told him he chose to marry a woman who viewed me as disposable trash, and that he actively chose to collude with a family of degenerate thieves to lock me in a psych ward for my real estate. You ask me why I'm being so cruel, I said, the words cutting through the phone line like a sharpened steel blade. You think selling that house to a foundation was a punishment designed to torture you. It wasn't a punishment, Derek. I'm not being ruthless to punish you. I'm being ruthless to save myself from your rot. I told him his sense of entitlement was a terminal disease, and that if I allowed him to maintain even the smallest microscopic grip on my life or my assets, he would eventually drag me down into his miserable, self-made grave. I explained that the house was now a permanent sanctuary for young men who actually wanted to build a future, instead of a stolen inheritance for a coward who only knew how to destroy one. I told him I didn't hate him, but I absolutely no longer recognized the man speaking on the other end of the line. I didn't feel anger anymore. I just felt a deep, permanent indifference. He was a grown man who had made his malicious choices, and now he was going to live the rest of his life chewing on the incredibly bitter consequences of his own actions. Derek let out a choked, desperate gasp on the other end of the line. He started stammering, his voice cracking, as he frantically tried to formulate another excuse, another pathetic plea for financial salvation or fatherly mercy. He begged me not to hang up, swearing he could change, promising he would earn my respect back if I just gave him one more chance to prove his worth. I didn't wait to hear the rest of his hollow, meaningless promises. I pulled the phone away from my ear and firmly pressed the end call button. instantly cutting off his voice and silencing his misery forever. I sat in my quiet, sun-drenched condo for a long moment, feeling the final heavy chain of parental obligation detach completely from my soul. I peeled the protective case off my cell phone. I pulled a small metal paperclip from my desk drawer and popped open the side tray of the device. I carefully extracted the tiny plastic SIM card, the digital lifeline that had kept me tethered to a family that actively tried to destroy my sanity and steal my life's work. I held the small, fragile chip between my thumb and index finger. I took a long, deep breath of absolute freedom and snapped it cleanly in half. I dropped the 2 jagged pieces of plastic into the kitchen trash can, listening to the satisfying little click as they hit the bottom. That simple action was the final physical seal on my new life. I was done with temporary leases, transitional spaces, and living out of cardboard boxes. Later that same week, I officially closed the deal on a massive top-floor penthouse right in the heart of the bustling financial district. I traded the quiet, accessible suburban streets for a towering, impenetrable fortress of reinforced glass and steel. My new building featured 2 4-hour biometric security, an underground parking garage, gated and monitored by armed guards, and a private keycard-restricted elevator that opened directly into my personal foyer. The front desk downstairs had strict, unshakable, legally binding instructions. No unannounced visitors were allowed past the lobby regardless of who they claimed to be or what tragic story they spun. I hired an elite moving crew to handle the transition, watching as my carefully curated belongings were placed into the massive, open-concept space. Walking into that penthouse for the first time was an experience that took my breath away. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the entire city skyline, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon sun. The silence in this apartment was fundamentally different from the silence in my old 4-bedroom house. That suburban silence used to be heavy, suffocating, constantly echoing with the ghosts of past family dinners and the lingering toxic anxiety of Derek's impending betrayals. The silence in this penthouse was crisp, clean, and fiercely independent. It was the undeniable sound of absolute autonomy. I walked across the polished hardwood floors, feeling a deep, untouchable security that no one could ever snatch away from me again. I unpacked a small box containing a framed photograph of Diane and set it gently on the sleek marble mantel. Looking at her smiling face, I allowed myself to reflect deeply on the grueling 40-year journey it took to reach this sanctuary in the sky. In the late 70s, being a young minority man trying to break into the commercial construction business was an exercise in daily, relentless humiliation. Banks routinely denied my commercial loan applications with fake, polite smiles, questioning my financial literacy simply because of how I looked. White suppliers intentionally delayed my material deliveries, testing my patience, hoping I would just give up and go back to swinging a hammer for someone else's company for minimum wage. Diane and I ate cheap drove trucks with rusted-out floorboards and worked exhausting double shifts just to keep the lights on. Every dollar I earned was the direct result of outworking, outsmarting, and outlasting a system built entirely to watch me fail. I built my wealth like a heavy, impenetrable fortress, believing that if I hoarded enough financial armor, I could permanently shield my family from the racial and economic hardships I had endured. I wanted Derek to have a smooth, paved road completely free of the potholes of prejudice and crushing poverty. But I realize now that by removing every obstacle from his path, I completely failed to teach him how to walk. I accidentally bankrolled his arrogance. I gave him the luxury of entitlement, and he repaid me by trying to strip me of my fundamental human rights. For decades, I lived far below my means, hoarding my resources for a generational legacy that ultimately tried to destroy me. Sitting in this penthouse surrounded by luxury I had previously denied myself, I finally gave myself permission to genuinely enjoy the fruits of my own agonizing labor. I was no longer the financial custodian for an ungrateful heir. I was a wealthy, retired man who had survived the ultimate betrayal. I started buying original artwork that caught my eye. I booked first-class tickets for a long vacation through Europe, Something Diane and I always talked about but never found the time to do. The money I had spent my entire life fiercely guarding was finally serving its true purpose. It was funding my total peace. As the late afternoon sun dipped completely below the horizon, painting the massive city in vibrant shades of deep purple and bruised orange, I walked over to my wooden dry bar. I pulled down a heavy crystal rocks glass and poured myself a generous measure of highly aged, incredibly expensive mezcal. The amber liquid glowed warmly under the recessed lighting. I walked over to the massive glass window, the surface cool and radiating a quiet comfort, and looked down at the bustling, illuminated city streets far below me. From this height, the chaos of the world seemed small, manageable, and completely distant. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the mezcal, letting the complex, smoky heat settle deep into my chest. A profound, razor-sharp realization crystallized in my mind, washing away any lingering microscopic doubt about the path I had chosen. Society constantly bombards us with the dangerous, toxic narrative that family is an absolute, unbreakable bond. We are conditioned from birth to believe that blood relations demand infinite patience, boundless financial support, and mandatory forgiveness. Regardless of the severity of the offense, they tell us to turn the other cheek to keep the peace, and to endure abuse in silence just to maintain the fragile illusion of a happy family unit. But standing here, looking out over the empire, I had reclaimed, I knew with absolute certainty that that narrative was a manipulative lie. Bloodline does not entitle anyone to be a parasite. Sharing a last name is not an all-access permanent pass to my sanity, my property, or my hard-earned wealth. If a person, even your own flesh and blood, proves they are perfectly willing to commit you to a psych facility and destroy your reputation just to cover their own pathetic debts, they forfeit any and all privileges of being family. They become a predator, and you don't negotiate with predators. You cut off their access to your life. People often preach that the ultimate path to healing is forgiveness. They claim you must forgive your abusers to move on and find closure. I completely reject that idea. The greatest, most profound liberation I have ever experienced wasn't found in forgiving Derek. It was found in the cold, permanent act of cutting him out of my life. The ultimate freedom is realizing you do not owe your life to those who only wish to consume it. My story isn't a traditional heartwarming tale of family reconciliation. It's a harsh, unfiltered lesson on self-preservation and the absolute necessity of enforcing brutal boundaries. Now, I want to pass the question to you, those who have listened to this harrowing journey all the way to the end. What do you think about my final decision? Do you believe I was completely justified in permanently severing all ties, changing my number, and leaving my son to face his severe criminal and financial consequences entirely alone? Or do you subscribe to the belief that a father should always leave the door cracked open for his child, no matter how atrocious or unforgivable the betrayal? Would you have the incredible courage to legally and emotionally cut off your own flesh and blood if they pushed you to the absolute edge of destruction? Please let me know your honest thoughts and share your own experiences down in the comments. I read every single one of them. If you found value in this story of survival, justice, and ultimate liberation, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more powerful life stories. Thank you for listening, and remember to always protect your peace. I'll see you in the next one, with love and respect. Looking out from my penthouse, surrounded by the peace I fought so fiercely to reclaim, another profound lesson settled heavily into my mind. As parents, especially those of us who survived the bitter sting of poverty and systemic prejudice, our deepest instinct is to give our children the easy life we were completely denied. We want to pave their roads with gold and remove every single stone that might make them trip. But I learned the hard way that when you remove all the struggle from a man's path, you completely destroy his ability to build character. I spent decades believing I was weaving a financial safety net for Derek. In reality, I was weaving him a hammock. A safety net catches a person when they fall while striving to climb higher. A hammock simply allows them to lie perfectly still, arrogantly expecting the world to rock them to sleep. My unwavering generosity didn't forge a strong, honorable man. It manufactured a weak, entitled parasite who viewed my grueling life's work as his personal, limitless bank account. True love isn't about shielding your adult children from the harsh storms of consequences. It's about requiring them to learn how to build their own shelter. When you constantly write the check, when you continuously bail them out of the disasters they brought upon themselves, you are actively robbing them of the opportunity to develop basic integrity. Setting bulletproof financial boundaries is the undeniable, ultimate form of self-respect. Your hard-earned savings, your property, and your retirement are the sacred rewards for your sacrifices. They are not under any circumstances an emergency fund for adults who refuse to take responsibility for their own miserable failures. Never bankroll your own disrespect. If you refuse to let anyone exploit your hard-earned legacy, hit the subscribe button right now and join a community that protects its peace tooth and nail. Yeah.